She poured the last of her flour onto the cracked wooden table and stared at it, a thin white dusting, barely enough for a single biscuit, and for the first time in 3 years of fighting alone, Evelyn Harper let out a sound she had been swallowing since the day they buried her husband. Not a cry, something rawer than that, a sound that came up from the floor of her chest and broke apart before it ever became words. Her daughter was asleep behind the thin curtain, and Evelyn stood in the dark of that kitchen in Red Willow, Montana, pressing both hands flat against the table, and told herself she could not give up. Not tonight, not ever. If that moment speaks to something deep inside you, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to know how far this story has traveled, because the woman you're about to meet, the one they called too big, too broken, too much, she is going to show every single one of them what they missed. This is her story, and it begins right now. The summer of 1884 came to Red Willow, Montana, like a sentence handed down by a judge with no mercy in him, hot, relentless, and utterly indifferent to who it crushed beneath its weight. The land baked and cracked. The creek that ran behind the Harper farm dropped lower every week until it was barely more than a seam of mud threading through pale grass. The cottonwood trees that Evelyn's late husband Thomas had always said were the finest trees in the territory stood with their leaves curled inward, exhausted, reaching for something the sky refused to give. Evelyn was up before the sun, the way she had been every morning since Thomas died. She didn't need a rooster or a clock. Her body had learned in the years since the funeral that sleep was a luxury she could not afford to love too much, so it released her early, and with no tenderness. She rose in the dark, splashed cold water on her face from the wash basin, and dressed in the same worn blue calico she had repaired twice at the hem and once across the right shoulder. She moved quietly, because her daughter Clara was still sleeping on the other side of the curtain Thomas had hung to give the child her own corner of the one-room house, and whatever peace Clara found in sleep, Evelyn was not willing to disturb it. She put the coffee on, not because she had much, but because the ritual of it kept her moving. She needed to keep moving. The moment she stopped moving was the moment everything she had been holding together would come apart. The Harper farm was not a large piece of land. Thomas had purchased it 6 years earlier with money saved across nearly a decade of hiring himself out to other men's ranches, and when he brought Evelyn out to see it the first time, standing at the edge of the property line and his face full of a pride so honest it almost hurt to look at, she had loved it immediately. Not because it was impressive, because the way he looked at that dry, stubborn, imperfect stretch of Montana earth was the same way he looked at her, like it was the most valuable thing he had ever held in his life. Thomas Harper had been the kind of man who did not see what other people saw. He did not see a woman the town considered too large to be lovely. He saw Evelyn, all of her, and he never once made her feel like a portion of herself was something to apologize for. When the horse threw him in the spring of 1881, when the head injury that the doctor said should not have been fatal turned out to be exactly that, Evelyn lost not only a husband. She lost the only person in Red Willow who had ever made her feel like she belonged in the space she occupied. She was 26 years old. Clara was not yet 3. And the town watched. Red Willow was not a cruel place in the way of deliberate evil. It was cruel in the way that small places so often are, which is to say it was thoughtless, and it was comfortable, and it had decided long before Evelyn's trouble began what kinds of women deserved what kinds of help. The women who deserved help were the ones who fit neatly into the picture the town had drawn of itself. Slender women with tidy houses and husbands who still breathed. Women who sat in the third pew on Sunday mornings and brought casseroles to church socials, and did not take up more space than they were allotted. Evelyn had always taken up more space than she was allotted. She was a large woman, tall, full-figured, built along lines that the women of Red Willow's social circles considered unfortunate. She wore it without apology, because Thomas had loved every inch of her, and she had let his love teach her not to be ashamed. But since his death, she had felt the town's eyes on her in ways that pressed and bruised. Women who had smiled at her when Thomas was alive now offered her a different kind of smile. Thin, careful, the kind that said they were very sorry for her loss, but also privately, not entirely surprised that life had turned out this way for someone like her. She heard what they said. Towns the size of Red Willow have no real walls. I don't know how she expects to keep that farm going. That was Marta Hensley, at the dry goods counter one Wednesday, not even bothering to lower her voice. A woman alone, and well, Evelyn had kept walking. She had put her flour and her salt on the counter, paid what she owed, and walked out with her spine straight and her chin level and her hands absolutely steady. And she had not permitted herself to shake until she was a half-mile down the road with nobody watching. She had been doing that for 3 years, the walking. Steadiness. The shaking alone later. This particular July morning started the way most mornings started, with more work than daylight, and a list of problems arranged in order of which one would kill her fastest. The irrigation ditch on the east side of the property had partially collapsed overnight, which meant the water she'd been routing to her kitchen garden was now spreading uselessly across the low ground and soaking into nothing. The garden was the most immediate source of food she had. If it failed, she would spend money she did not have at the general store, and if she spent money she did not have, she would fall further behind on the note she owed the bank, and if she fell further behind on that note. She did not let herself finish the thought. She picked up her shovel, and she went to work. The sun was barely up and already making promises it intended to keep brutal, uncompromising heat roll across the open land with nothing to stop it. Evelyn worked in it without complaint. She had learned that complaining to no one accomplished exactly nothing, so she had mostly stopped. She dug at the collapsed section of the ditch, moving heavy, wet earth with a shovel that had a crack in the handle she'd wrapped with a strip of leather to keep it from splitting entirely. She worked for an hour. Her dress was soaked through before the church bell had struck 7. Clara came out at 7:30, 9 years old, and already with the same serious eyes Thomas had carried, watching her mother from the doorway of the farmhouse, with an expression too old for her face. "Mama," she said. "Can I help? You can get yourself some breakfast," Evelyn said without stopping. "There's cornbread on the board. I already ate." "Then go check on the chickens." "Mama Clara." Evelyn paused, straightening, pressing one hand to the small of her back where the ache had already set in. She looked at her daughter across the damaged ditch, with the morning light coming sideways and gold between them. "The chicken, sweetheart, please," Clara went. She was a good girl. She was a girl who understood, in the way children understand things they should not have to understand yet, that her mother was carrying something that could not be set down. By 10 o'clock, Evelyn had repaired enough of the ditch to restore partial flow to the garden. It was not perfect, nothing was ever perfect, but the tomatoes and the squash and the beans would get water today, and that was what mattered. She stood at the edge of the repaired section, breathing hard, and drank from the canteen she'd brought out with her that morning, and looked at her farm with the particular expression of a person who loves something they are afraid of losing. She was afraid. She had been afraid for 3 years. But she had learned, she was still learning, that fear and forward motion could coexist. That you could be terrified down to your marrow and still pick up the shovel. Still repair the ditch. Still make the cornbread. Still check on the chickens and look your daughter in the eyes and tell her without words that the world had not beaten them yet. She was still telling herself that same thing when she heard the wagon coming up the road. She knew the wagon before she saw who was driving it. The hardware and general goods wagon from the Aldrich Supply Company, Harlan Aldrich's operation, which ran out of a large building on the main street of Red Willow, and which Harlan ran with the proprietor sectionish of a man who had understood very early that the person who controlled the supplies in a frontier town controlled a great deal more than supplies. He was a barrel-shaped man in his early 50s with a red face and small eyes that were always calculating something and a voice like gravel dragged over tin. He pulled the wagon up at the edge of her property and sat looking at her for a moment without climbing down, which was a choice, and they both knew it. Mrs. Harper, he said. Mr. Aldrich. She rested the shovel against her hip and waited. Heard you had some trouble out here this morning. Nothing I couldn't handle. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. See, that's the thing I keep wondering about. He climbed down from the wagon now, slowly, with the unhurried movement of a man who has never once felt the need to rush, because nothing and nobody has ever been in a position to make him. He walked to her fence line and stopped there, looking around the property, with an expression she had seen before, and hated the expression of a man doing math. This place is a lot of work for one woman, I manage. Sure you do. He looked at her then. The look was not kind. It never had been. You know my offer still stands. Evelyn's jaw tightened. She knew his offer. He had made it twice in the past year, each time framed as generosity, each time carrying the particular flavor of a transaction she wanted no part of. Harlan Aldrich wanted the Harper farm. More specifically, he wanted the water rights that came with it, because the creek that ran through her land connected to the larger water source that 3 other ranches depended on. And the man who controlled the connection point controlled the ranches. Thomas had understood this. He had told her, the winter before he died, that Aldrich had approached him about selling. He had told him no. He had told Evelyn to remember that no was the right answer. My answer is the same as it was before, she said. And the same as it was before that. Now, Mrs. Harper. He tilted his head the way a man does when he is preparing to speak to a woman as though she is a child who requires patient instruction. I'm trying to help you here. That note you've got at the bank, I happen to know it's coming, due in 30 days. And I happen to know you don't have what you owe. The cold that went through her had nothing to do with the temperature, which was already climbing toward brutal. That's between me and the bank, he smiled. It did not reach his eyes, because Richard Folsom over at the bank happens to be a close personal friend of mine, and he mentioned just in conversation, you understand that he's getting nervous about your situation. Nervous bank managers do nervous bank manager things. She stared at him. You talked to Richard Folsom about my account? I ran into him at dinner. He spread his hands. Just conversation, like I said. But here's the thing. Evelyn, he used her first name deliberately, and she felt the deliberateness of it like a hand pressed flat against her chest. The farm's not going to survive another bad year. You know that. I know that. The question is whether you're going to let pride make the decision for you, or whether you're going to be sensible. Get off my property, she said. Her voice was very quiet. She had discovered that the quieter she became in moments like this, the steadier she was. Get off my property, Mr. Aldrich, and do not come back without being invited. His face shifted. Something in the small eyes went flat. You're making a mistake, that's my right. It is, he agreed, and he turned back toward his wagon with the same unhurried movement he'd arrived with. But mistakes have consequences out here. You know that better than most. He climbed up onto the seat and gathered the reins and looked down at her from that small elevation with something that was not quite a smile. 30 days, Mrs. Harper. I'd think hard on it. He drove away. She watched the wagon until it turned at the road and disappeared behind the line of cottonwoods. And then she picked up her shovel and went back to work. Because there was nothing else to do, and because stopping was not something she could afford. She was still working at noon when she heard a different horse. This one came from the north, from the direction of the Hawthorne land. And it was a single rider moving at a pace that was neither urgent nor leisurely, but somewhere in between the pace of a man, who is going somewhere with purpose, but is not being chased. She didn't look up right away. She was resetting a fence post that had listed dangerously to one side, and the work required both hands and most of her concentration. But she was aware of him. She was always aware of Caleb Hawthorne when he rode past. That was something she had never said aloud, and something she had no intention of ever saying aloud. Because it led nowhere and meant nothing, and she was a practical woman living a practical life with a child to feed and a banknote coming due in 30 days. Caleb Hawthorne was 34 years old, and he owned the largest cattle operation in the region, a spread of land called Hawthorne Ranch, that ran for miles in the direction of the mountains and employed more men than the town had households. He was not a flashy man. He wore the same kind of worn denim and plain work shirts as his hands, and his hat was good quality but kept without ceremony, and he rode with a quietness that matched everything else about him. He was not a man who performed himself for an audience. He had lived alone in the big ranch house on his property for 6 years. Since Margaret. Evelyn knew about Margaret, the way she knew most things in Red Willow, through the gaps between other people's spoken words. Through the careful way people avoided certain topics, Caleb Hawthorne was within earshot. Margaret Hawthorne had been Caleb's wife for 2 years, before she died of a fever in the winter of 1878. People said he had loved her with the kind of love a man only finds once. People said that after she died, he had become the man he was now capable, hard-working, respected, and entirely closed. He did not attend socials, he did not seek company. He came to town when he needed supplies, did his business without lingering, and went home. The women of Red Willow, who had once hoped to change that, had long since redirected their attention to more accessible options. Evelyn had never hoped to change anything about Caleb Hawthorne. She was not in the business of hope where men were concerned. She was in the business of survival, but she was aware of him. That was simply a fact she carried. He rode past the fence line and then, which was not what he usually did, he pulled his horse up. She kept working. She drove the post deeper with the mallet, testing it against the pressure of both hands, deciding it would hold. Mrs. Harper. His voice was even. It wasn't warm, exactly, but it wasn't the calculated warmth that men used when they wanted something from you. It was simply a voice stating simply a thing. She straightened and looked at him across the fence line. He was sitting his horse the way he did everything, with a kind of effortless stillness, and he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately name. Not pity. She would have recognized pity. She had become expert at identifying it and despising it. This was something else, something more like attention. The way a person looks at something they have been watching from a distance, and have finally decided to address directly. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said, "I saw Aldrich's wagon out this morning." She said nothing. "I know what he wants," Caleb said. "He's been working his way around to it for 2 years. That's a private matter. I know it is." He reached up and touched the brim of his hat briefly, not quite a tip, more of an acknowledgement. "I'm not trying to get into your business, ma'am, I just..." He paused. It was a real pause, not a performed one, like a man who says things carefully because he means them. "I wanted you to know that if you need something, any kind of help with what needs doing out here, I'd consider it a fair trade for good work. I'm not offering charity." She looked at him steadily. "What are you offering?" "There's fence work needs doing on the south quarter of my property. My foreman's got 3 men occupied with the herd and can't spare anyone. I could use someone who knows what they're doing with a post and a mallet." He glanced at the fence section she'd just finished. "Looks to me like you do." It was so unexpected that she almost laughed. Not from amusement, from the sheer strange novelty of being spoken to as though she were a capable person. "I have my own work to tend to," she said. "The work would be 2 afternoons. Cash at the end of each day." He met her eyes directly. "The offer's real, Mrs. Harper. Take it or leave it, and no hard feelings either way." She studied him for a long moment. He did not fill the silence with extra words, which was another thing about him that was unusual. Most men she had encountered could not endure a silence without rushing to fill it. Caleb Hawthorne sat in the silence like it was furniture he was comfortable around. "I'll think on it," she said. He nodded once. He gathered his reins. "Good afternoon, ma'am." He rode on. She watched him go, and then she went back to work. She thought about it all afternoon. She thought about it while she fed the chickens and checked the garden and started the evening meal, and helped Clara with the reading primer she'd been working through since spring. She thought about it while she lay in the dark after Clara was asleep, listening to the sounds of the Montana summer outside, the crickets, the distant cattle, the wind moving through the cottonwoods with a sound like breathing. She was not a foolish woman. She understood that Caleb Hawthorne's fence did not actually require her specifically. He had hands enough for the work. Whatever his reason for the offer, it was not strictly practical necessity. But the money was real. 2 days' wages, cash, would make a measurable difference against what she owed. And the work itself, she was not afraid of work. She had never been afraid of work. What she was afraid of was what it looked like, a widow going to work on a rich man's ranch. The things that got said in towns like Red Willow about women who accepted help from wealthy men who lived alone. The currency of reputation and how quickly it could be devalued. She lay there and she waited, because she was a practical woman, and that is what practical women do. In the morning she sent Clara to the Hensley farm with a jar of preserves and a note asking if they could watch her for the afternoon. Then she put on her better calico, the green one, the one with no visible repairs, braided her thick dark hair into a low knot at the back of her neck, picked up her work gloves, and walked the 2 miles to Hawthorne Ranch. Caleb was already at the South Quarter line when she arrived, along with a young hand named Tomas, who looked barely old enough to shave and who went wide-eyed when Evelyn appeared and then quickly redirected his eyes elsewhere in the way of a young man who has been taught that staring is rude. Caleb looked at her with the same level expression he always wore, touched his hat brim, and handed her a post-hole digger. "South End needs 6 new posts," he said. "Ground's hard from the drought." "It'll take some doing. I've been working hard ground all summer," she said. Something shifted in his face, barely anything, but she caught it. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I expect you have." They worked. She dug and he drove posts, and Tomas strung wire between them, and nobody talked much because there was work to do, and the heat demanded efficiency. But she noticed that Caleb worked at the same pace she did, not slowing down for her benefit or speeding ahead to demonstrate superiority. He just worked beside her, as though they were equals sharing a task that needed doing. At the end of the first afternoon, he paid her exactly what he had promised. He counted the bills into her hand with the same directness he brought to everything else. She thanked him without ceremony and walked home. She came back the second day. On the second day, during the break they took at noon, in the shade of the only substantial tree on the South Quarter, Tomas excused himself to check on the water situation at the creek. And for a few minutes it was just Evelyn and Caleb sitting with their backs against the tree and their hats tilted forward against the filtered light. She said, without really planning to, "Why did you offer me the work?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because you needed it," he said. "And because I actually needed it done. Both things can be true." "People will talk. People talk regardless," he said. "I've never found it a useful guide for decision-making." She looked at him sideways. "That's easy to say when you've got enough money that it doesn't matter what people say." He turned to look at her then, and something in his expression was very direct and not entirely comfortable. "You're right," he said. "That was an easy thing for me to say. I take it back." He paused. "I offered you the work because I've watched you manage that farm alone for 3 years, and I have never once seen you ask for help. Not because you didn't need it. But he stopped again. Because you've learned that help in this town generally comes attached to something you don't want to owe." The accuracy of it hit her somewhere in the center of her chest. She did not respond immediately because she wasn't sure what response was appropriate. "That's an observant thing to notice," she said finally. "I pay attention," he said. Simple as that. She went home that evening and sat with the 2 days' wages on the kitchen table and thought about Caleb Hawthorne for a long time. Not in the way she had sometimes thought about him before at a careful remove, in the abstract. But directly, the way you think about a person who has surprised you. He surprised her. She was not accustomed to being surprised. 3 days later, she was in town at the dry goods store, spending some of the wages she'd earned on a small amount of flour and the coffee she had been going without, because she couldn't afford it, when she heard her name. Not spoken directly to her. Spoken about her, in the adjacent aisle, in Marta Hensley's carrying voice, and the lower rumble of what sounded like Harold Bishop, who owned the feed store, and who had appointed himself one of the town's primary moral authorities. "Did you hear she was out at Hawthorne Ranch 2 days in a row?" "I did hear that." A meaningful pause, the kind that carries a paragraph's worth of implication. I just think, Marta said, it sends a certain kind of message. A widow woman going out to a single man's property. And the way she looks, another pause. Well, it isn't hard to imagine what she must be thinking. What they both must be thinking. She stood very still in the next aisle. She had a 5-pound bag of flour in one hand, and she was holding it tightly enough that her knuckles had gone pale. That woman has been talking to Aldrich too, Harold said. He told me she refused his offer on the farm, which is foolish. She can't keep that place going. No, Marta agreed. She can't. But she's got that pride, you know the kind. The kind of pride, her tone implied, that big women develop as a compensatory mechanism, a shield for the crime of taking up too much space. Evelyn set the flour down on the shelf very quietly. She picked up her basket with both items she'd planned to buy, and walked to the counter and paid for them. And she said good morning to the clerk, and she walked out of the store, and she kept walking, kept her head up, kept her spine straight, all the way to the edge of town where nobody was looking, and then she sat down on a fence post in the shade of a wall and put her face in her hands and breathed. Just breathed. She was not crying. She had decided a long time ago that she would not cry where this town could see her. But breathing was necessary and basic, and not a concession to anything. Mrs. Harper. She dropped her hands, looked up. Caleb Hawthorne was standing 10 feet away, his horse tied to the hitching post outside the feed store, a supply list in one hand and a look on his face that said he had been close enough to hear, or had seen her face from enough of a distance to understand. She straightened, reset her expression. Mr. Hawthorne. He said nothing for a moment. Then he walked toward her, not rapidly, and he stopped a respectful distance away and looked at her with those steady, dark eyes. You don't have to do that, he said. Do what? Pretend. He said it without drama. I heard what they were saying. I'd wager you heard it too. She held his gaze. It doesn't matter. Maybe not. But it still hurts. He said this like a simple fact he had discovered through personal experience and not a sympathy he was performing. I know what it's like when a town decides what you are and won't let you be anything else. She looked at him for a long moment. Your wife, she said quietly. His expression shifted not much, but she had been watching his face long enough now to read the small shifts. After Margaret died, he said, they decided I was the tragic widower. They had very specific ideas about what that meant and how I should behave and who I should eventually become. I didn't fit the picture, so they drew their own. And you stopped caring what they thought. I stopped letting it decide things for me. He paused. There's a difference. She thought about that. Yes, she said slowly. I suppose there is. She walked home, and she thought about him again. And this time she did not put the thought at a careful remove. She let it stay right where it was. 2 weeks later, Harlan Aldrich came back. This time he did not come alone. He brought Richard Folsom from the bank and a man Evelyn had never seen before. A lawyer type with an Eastern suit and a leather satchel, and the three of them arrived at her farm in a proper carriage, as though they were conducting official business. Which, in their minds, she understood, was exactly what they were. Clara was in the yard feeding the chickens when they arrived. Evelyn saw her daughter look at the carriage with wide eyes, and she said quietly, "Go inside, sweetheart," and Clara went without argument. Which told Evelyn that her daughter already understood more about the weight of the moment than a 9-year-old should have to. Aldrich climbed down from the carriage with the lawyer, and Folsom arranged themselves on either side of him like a formal presentation. Mrs. Harper, Folsom said. He was a narrow man, precise, and he had the particular discomfort of someone who doesn't enjoy the parts of his work that require looking directly at people. I'm afraid we have a matter to discuss. Discuss it then. He opened a leather folder. Your note on the property comes due in 18 days. As of this morning, the outstanding balance is, he said, a number. It was a number she knew. It was a number she had been counting backward from for months. I'm aware of what I owe, she said. The bank has assessed your current situation and determined that an extension is not in the institution's best interest at this time. He glanced at Aldrich without meaning to. She caught it. If the note is not settled in full by the due date, we will be obligated to begin foreclosure proceedings on the property. The word hit her like a physical thing. Foreclosure. She had known it was a possibility. She had been refusing to let herself say it aloud because there was a superstition to naming disasters you were not yet sure you could prevent. But here it was, named, in her yard, in front of her farmhouse, in front of the man who had engineered it. Mr. Aldrich, she said, turning to look at him directly, this is your doing. Aldrich spread his hands. Now, Evelyn, do not call me by my first name. The quiet returned to her voice. The quiet that meant she had put herself somewhere internal and controlled. You went to the bank. You called in your friendship. And you arranged for this visit precisely 18 days before my note comes due, because you calculated that 18 days is not enough time for me to raise what I need. He looked at her with something almost like admiration. You're a smart woman, he said, which is why I think if you're being honest with yourself, you know what the sensible answer is here. The sensible answer, she repeated. Sell me the farm. I'll pay you a fair price, more than fair, and you'll walk away with enough to start something else, somewhere else. You and the girl clean start. He paused. That's not an enemy's offer, Mrs. Harper. That's a businessman making a reasonable proposal. She looked at the three of them, the businessman, the banker, the lawyer arranged in her yard, beneath her sky, in front of the farmhouse Thomas had built, and she felt something move through her that was past anger. Something colder and cleaner than anger. Get off my property, she said. All three of you. Folsom began Mrs. Harper. 18 days, she said. You've given me 18 days. I intend to use them. Get off my land. They left. They did not leave quickly, because men like Aldrich are too careful of their dignity to be seen hurrying. But they left. When the carriage turned out of her gate and the sound of the horses faded, Evelyn went into the farmhouse and sat down at the kitchen table and put her hands flat on the surface and looked at nothing and thought. She had 18 days. She did not have the money. She had perhaps a third of it, saved in a tin box under the floorboard, scraped together over months of the kinds of economies that made her stomach turn, buying the cheapest flour, going without coffee, stretching a chicken over 4 meals. Wearing dresses until they were repaired in so many places, the original fabric was barely the majority. A third of the money, 18 days. She was still sitting there, working through the arithmetic of an impossible situation, when she heard a knock at her door. Clara had been behind the curtain since the carriage left, and the knock made both of them still. Evelyn opened the door. Caleb Hawthorne stood on her porch. He was not in his work clothes. He was in his better shirt, still plain, still simple, but clean and pressed in the way of a man who wanted to communicate that he took the moment seriously. His hat was in his hands. I saw them come, he said. I saw them go. He met her eyes. I'm not going to pretend I don't know what Aldrich is doing, because I've been watching him do it for 2 years, and I should have said something sooner. He paused. I'm saying something now. She looked at him standing there with his hat in his hands, and something in her chest, that she had been keeping very carefully locked, did something that felt uncomfortably close to opening. What are you saying? She asked. I want to help, he said. I have what you owe the bank. I can settle the note before the due date, and Aldrich loses his leverage. She stared at him. I won't take your money. I'm not giving it, he said. I'm investing it. He held her gaze direct, no performance in it. I'm proposing a business arrangement. The Harper farm has the water rights that 3 ranches in this region depend on, including mine. If Aldrich gets his hands on them, he controls the water, and he will use that control to squeeze every operation within 20 miles. I have a direct interest in seeing that not happen. So this isn't charity, Mrs. Harper. It's property protection. She was quiet for a long moment. She was parsing it, turning it over, looking for the part that was false. And if I paid you back, she said slowly, you'd expect. Fair terms, he said immediately. Written and signed, same as any business arrangement. Whatever you're comfortable with. Why are you doing this? She said. Not accusingly, genuinely, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, because it's the right thing to do. And because he stopped, started again. Because you are a good woman and a capable one, and you deserve better than what this town has been giving you. And I am tired of watching from a distance and telling myself it isn't my business. He turned his hat in his hands. I reckon it's become my business. She looked at him for a long time. Come inside, she said finally. I'll put coffee on. And we'll talk terms. He sat at her kitchen table with his hat on the seat beside him, and she made the coffee, the good coffee, the coffee she had bought, with the wages he had paid her, and they talked. Clara appeared from behind her curtain at some point, and stood in the doorway looking at Caleb with Thomas's serious eyes. And Caleb looked back at her, with a kind of careful respect, and said, "You must be Miss Clara." And Clara, who trusted almost no strangers, said after a moment, "Yes, sir," and retreated back behind the curtain. They talked for 2 hours. He was not a man who talked easily, but he talked honestly, and she discovered, as she had begun to suspect, that the silences between his words were not emptiness but weight. He chose his words because he meant them. By the time the coffee was gone, they had agreed on terms. He would settle the banknote. She would repay him over 3 years at no interest, in whatever combination of cash and labor she could manage. The water rights remained hers, specifically and irrevocably. When he stood to leave, he picked up his hat and held it, and looked at her across the kitchen table and said, "Mrs. Harper, whatever they say in town about this, and they will say things, I want you to know that my opinion of you is formed by what I've seen with my own eyes. And what I've seen is a woman worth knowing." She held his gaze and said, "Thank you, Mr. Hawthorne." And then, because it was true and because she believed in saying true things, "You surprised me." "Good," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile, but was close enough that she counted it. "I reckon we could both stand a few surprises." He put his hat on and walked out, and she stood in the doorway and watched him go. And Clara appeared at her elbow and slipped her hand into Evelyn's, and they stood there together in the July evening, watching the dust settle where his horse had gone. "Mama Clara said I liked him," Evelyn said. "Did you like him?" Evelyn looked at the empty road for a moment. Then she looked down at her daughter. "Yes," she said, truthfully. "I believe I did." Part 2. The morning after, Caleb Hawthorne sat at her kitchen table and drank her coffee and looked at her like she was a person worth looking at. Evelyn woke up with the particular feeling of someone who has made a decision they cannot unmake and is not entirely sure whether to be relieved or terrified. She lay still for a moment, listening to Clara's breathing on the other side of the curtain, and ran through the terms of the agreement the way she had run through them 3 times before falling asleep. The note would be settled. The water rights would remain hers. She would repay Caleb Hawthorne over 3 years, and the arrangement was written on paper that both of them had signed at her kitchen table, with a stub of pencil she'd sharpened with her pocket knife, and it was real, and it was done. What was also real, and also done, was that by sundown the following day, every person in Red Willow, with ears and idle time, which was most of them, would know that Evelyn Harper had accepted help from Caleb Hawthorne. And they would not call it a business arrangement. They never did. When the woman in question was the kind of woman they had already decided they knew everything about. She got up and made coffee and told herself it didn't matter. She had told herself that many times before. It was getting easier to say and not one bit easier to mean. Clara came out from behind her curtain, still half asleep, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, and Evelyn braided it for her at the table while the biscuits were cooking, her fingers moving through the familiar rhythm of it. Clara sat straight and still the way she always did during the braiding. She'd learned early that wiggling extended the process, and after a moment she said, "Is Mr. Hawthorne going to come back?" Evelyn's fingers slow. "I expect he'll come by to discuss the arrangements with the bank." "That's not what I asked." Evelyn looked at the back of her daughter's head. 9 years old and already impossible to redirect. Thomas's child through and through. "Finish your breakfast," she said. "And yes, I expect he will." Clara said nothing else, but Evelyn could see the small satisfied set of her shoulders that meant she had received the answer she was looking for. Caleb came by that afternoon as she'd expected, briefly and with purpose. He had been to the bank already. Richard Folsom, he reported, had been substantially less comfortable in his presence than he had been in Evelyn's yard with Harlan Aldrich standing beside him. The note would be formally settled by end of the following week. Aldrich had not yet been informed. He'll know soon enough, Caleb said. They were standing at her porch rail, not inside, she had decided, for the sake of whatever remained of her reputation in this town, that kitchen table conversations with Caleb Hawthorne were better kept to a minimum, unless strictly necessary. When he finds out, he won't be quiet about it. I know, she said. He'll say things regardless. You said so yourself. Something in his expression shifted. He recognized his own words coming back at him, and he almost smiled. Almost. She was beginning to catalog the degrees of that almost smile. There were more of them than she would have guessed from a man people described as having no softness in him. Fair enough, he said. He touched his hat brim. I'll be by next week when it's settled. In the meantime, if Aldrich comes to this property again, I'd like to know about it. You'd like to know about it, she repeated, testing the phrase. Yes, ma'am. Why? He held her gaze steadily. Because I've put money into the protection of these water rights, and I have a business interest in knowing if someone is attempting to threaten them. She held his gaze right back. Is that the only reason? The pause was brief but real. No, he said. He touched his hat again and left. She stood on the porch for a moment, after his horse rounded the cottonwoods, and she pressed her lips together, and she told the flutter in her chest to behave itself, and then she went inside and started supper. It took 4 days for the town to find out. She knew the exact moment it happened because she was at the well in the center of town square, filling 2 water jugs, when she heard the shift, that particular change in ambient noise that happens when a piece of information passes from one end of a small community to the other, and suddenly everyone is carrying it. Conversations dropped a register, glances redirected. She felt it before she saw it, the way you feel a change in weather before the clouds arrive. Martha Deacon was the first to approach her directly. Martha was not a malicious woman. She was the kind of woman who considered herself friendly, which was its own particular danger, because it gave her a reason to say things she should have kept to herself. She came to Evelyn at the well with a basket over her arm and a look of concerned curiosity that she had arranged to appear like sympathy. Evelyn, she said, I heard about your situation with the bank. I'm so sorry, honey. Evelyn capped her first jug. It's been resolved. Yes, that's well. Martha glanced around, which told Evelyn there were other ears in the vicinity that Martha was performing for as much as speaking to. People are saying that Caleb Hawthorne settled your note. People are efficient, Evelyn said. It's just, well, people worry. A single woman, and a man like Caleb, who hasn't shown interest in anyone since Margaret. She dropped her voice to a register that was somehow louder for being quieter. Is there something? I mean, are the two of you? We have a business arrangement. Evelyn capped the second jug and lifted both. The weight was considerable. She carried it without adjusting her expression. The water rights on this property are valuable to several ranches in the area. Mr. Hawthorne has an investment interest in ensuring they remain out of Aldrich's hands. The details are in writing. She looked at Martha directly. Is there anything else you needed from the well, or were you just here for the information? Martha's mouth opened and then closed. Evelyn picked up her jugs and walked home. Behind her, she heard the murmur resume, and she walked away from it the way she always did, with her spine straight and her chin level, and the shaking saved for later. Harlan Aldrich found out the same day. She knew this because at 4 o'clock that afternoon, one of his hired men arrived at her property line on horseback and sat there for a full minute looking at the farm with an expression that was meant to communicate something unpleasant, and then rode away without a word. It was not a subtle message. Aldrich was not a subtle man when his plans were disrupted. She went and checked that all her gates were latched, and her chickens were in the coop, and her tool shed was locked. Then she went inside and wrote a note to Caleb Hawthorne, and sent it with the boy from the neighboring farm who sometimes ran messages for her in exchange for eggs, and the note said only, Aldrich sent a man by today. Thought you should know per our arrangement. The reply came the next morning, not as a written note, but as Caleb himself arriving at her property at 6 in the morning, when she was already out working on a stretch of fence on the west side that had been weakening for weeks. He rode up and dismounted and without asking picked up the spare mallet. She kept leaning against the post stack and started working alongside her. She looked at him sideways. You didn't have to come yourself. I know, he said. He drove a post into the ground with 3 clean strikes. But I wanted to. They worked in silence for a while. She was learning that silence with Caleb Hawthorne was a different texture than silence with most people. It didn't demand filling. It sat between them comfortably, like a third party that both of them were at ease with. He's going to escalate, Caleb said after a time. I know, he doesn't lose gracefully. He paused. He lost the water rights and he knows why he lost them, and men like Aldrich don't absorb a loss without finding someone to make pay for it. She drove her own post into the ground. You think he'll come after you? I think he'll come after what he can reach. He can't reach me easily. But he stopped. She looked at him. But I'm easier. His jaw tightened in a way she was learning to read as emotion he was managing carefully. I won't let that happen. Caleb. It was the first time she'd used his first name out loud, and they both registered it a brief beat of awareness that neither of them remarked on. I've been managing Harlan Aldrich by myself for 3 years. I'm not afraid of him. I know you're not, he said. That's part of what worries me. He held her gaze. You're not afraid of things you should maybe take more seriously because you've had to deal with everything alone. Because there hasn't been anyone in your corner. The plain accuracy of it landed on her like something she hadn't expected. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she looked back at the fence line. There is now, she said quietly, testing whether it was true. He said equally quietly, yes, ma'am, there is. The shift between them after that was subtle, and neither of them named it. But it was there. It moved through the following weeks like current beneath still water present, directional, carrying things towards somewhere. Caleb began finding reasons to pass by her property more often than the road strictly required. He sent Tomas, his youngest hand, to help with the heavier fence work on 2 separate occasions, specifying that the boy was on Hawthorne Ranch wages and Evelyn owed nothing for it. She argued this point with him exactly once, and he listened to her argument with complete and genuine patience and then said that Tomas needed the practice and the fence needed the work, and both things were true. So she could object if she wanted to, but it wouldn't change the outcome. She had looked at him for a long moment and then said, "You are very stubborn," and he'd said, "Yes, ma'am," as though she'd complimented him. She laughed. It surprised both of them, the laugh, the real one, rising up before she could decide whether to let it. She hadn't heard that sound from herself in long enough, that it felt unfamiliar, a little raw around the edges. He looked at her when she laughed, and something in his face went very still in a way that she filed away and examined later when she was alone. Clara, meanwhile, had taken to watching for Caleb's horse on the road, with the focused attention of a child who has decided that a person is important before she has any particular reason for the verdict. She asked Evelyn questions about him in her direct and relentless 9-year-old way. How old was he? Why didn't he have any children? Was his house very big? Why didn't he smile more? He smiles, Evelyn said. I've seen him twice and he didn't smile either time. He smiles in small ways. Clara considered this. Like how? Like the corner of his mouth, Evelyn said, before she could think better of it. Clara looked at her mother with an expression that was frankly appraising. How do you know what the corner of his mouth does? Eat your supper. Mama supper, Clara. The weeks that passed were not without their difficulties. Aldrich made his displeasure known through the instruments available to him, which were more numerous than Evelyn Ian would have liked. 2 of her regular customers at the small market stall she'd run on Saturday mornings, selling preserves, dried herbs, the excess from her kitchen garden, stopped coming. When she asked carefully after them, she was told they had found another supplier. She understood without being told that the supplier was not the point. The point was that Aldrich still had tools and he intended to use them. The Saturday stall revenue was small but real. She reworked her calculations for the week without it and arrived at a number that was uncomfortable but survivable. Barely. She did not tell Caleb about it immediately. She told herself it was because it was a small matter, and she could handle small matters herself. She told herself that twice before admitting to herself that she was also testing something. Testing whether she could still stand on her own ground while accepting that someone else was standing nearby. Whether help and self-sufficiency could coexist without one consuming the other. She had been alone so long that she was not entirely sure she knew how to occupy a situation where she wasn't. He found out anyway. He found out because Red Willow was a small town, and Tomas had a mother who ran a laundry and who talked to the woman who ran the bakery who talked to everyone. And the information passed from person to person and arrived at Hawthorne Ranch within 4 days. Caleb arrived at her property the following Saturday morning and sat on his horse and looked at her stall and said, "You're short 2 customers." "I'm managing," she said. "I know you are." He dismounted and tied his horse and looked at her with the directness that she had stopped finding startling and started finding the most honest thing she encountered on any given day. "I'm going to buy preserves. You don't need preserves. I have 22 ranch hands. They eat a remarkable amount of food." He looked at her selection. "How many jars do you have?" She looked at him for a moment. "Caleb, how many jars, Evelyn?" she told him. He bought a third of them, right there, at her asking price, with no negotiation. She wrote him a receipt and handed it to him, and he folded it and put it in his shirt pocket and said, "I'll be back next week." "People will talk," she said, which had become something of a recurring phrase between them. "I know," he said. "I care," she said. "Not for myself, for you. You have a business to run and a reputation to maintain, and Aldrich is already looking for Evelyn." He said her name the way he said most things, simply, without decoration, with the full weight of his attention behind it. "I'm not doing this because I don't know the cost. I'm doing it because I've decided the cost is worth it." He held her gaze. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" She understood. She was standing in the July heat, in the middle of a Saturday morning in Red Willow, Montana, and she understood perfectly what he was telling her, and it was both the most frightening and the most welcome thing anyone had said to her in years. "I'll have more preserves next week," she said, because she did not yet have the words for the other thing. He nodded once, he touched his hat, he left. She stood at her stall for a long time after his horse rounded the corner, and she did not shake. She was learning slowly that the shaking she'd saved for private moments was becoming less necessary. That there was something about being seen fully, steadily, honestly seen, that made a person feel less like they were holding themselves together by pure will. It was a strange and unfamiliar feeling. She handled it carefully, the way you handle anything you haven't held before, uncertain of its weight. Marta Hensley was at the stall the following Tuesday, not to buy anything, which Evelyn knew immediately, because Marta always had a specific and particular energy when she arrived without a shopping basket. She arrived in the particular way of a woman who is delivering a warning she has convinced herself is kindness. "I've been hearing things," Marta said, settling in for it. "About you and Caleb Hawthorne. Have you?" Evelyn was organizing her remaining preserve jars into a more appealing arrangement, and she did not stop. "People are saying, well, people notice that he comes by more often than a business arrangement would require. People," Evelyn said, "should concern themselves more with their own arrangements." "I'm saying this as a friend, Evelyn." Marta's voice lowered. "You're a widow. You've been through a great deal. And a man like Caleb, he hasn't been interested in anyone since Margaret. People wonder what his intentions are, and whether careful pause. Whether a man of his standing would truly be looking to a woman in your position." Evelyn set down the jar she was holding. She turned and looked at Marta Hensley with a level and complete attention. "My position," she said. Marta's cheeks went slightly pink. "I only mean I know what you mean." Evelyn's voice was very quiet. You mean that I am too large and too poor and too far from what this town considers worth wanting for a man like Caleb Hawthorne to see anything real in me. You mean that whatever his interest, it cannot be genuine because I am not the kind of woman genuine interest belongs to. She held Marta's gaze without blinking. Is that what you mean? Marta said nothing. Thank you for the warning, Evelyn said. She turned back to her jars. I'll keep it in mind. She heard Marta leave, and she kept her hands busy, and she let the words she'd just said sit inside her chest and ache, because they were true. That was what the town believed. That was what had been communicated to her in 100 indirect and direct ways across 3 years, and the aching was useful. It reminded her of what she was fighting, not just Aldrich, not just the banknote, but the specific and persistent story this place wanted to tell about what a woman like her was allowed to expect from life. She thought about that ache all afternoon. She was still thinking about it when, at 4:30, Caleb appeared at her gate in his work clothes, which meant he'd come directly from the ranch, without stopping to change, which was not what he usually did when he came by at the end of the day. She looked at his face and knew something had happened. Come inside, she said. He came in. He sat at the kitchen table. He did not take off his hat right away, which told her the thing he was carrying was something he hadn't quite decided how to set down. She put coffee on because that was what she did, and because it gave both of them something to do with the moment, and she sat across from him and waited. Aldrich went to 3 of my largest suppliers today, Caleb said. He's been telling them that I've made bad business decisions, that my judgment can't be trusted, that my operation is in a weaker position than it appears. He paused. He used the arrangement with your farm as evidence. Evelyn went very still. Caleb, he's not finished. He also went to Judge Kramer. He finally took his hat off and set it on the table and looked at her with an expression that was doing a great deal of controlled work. Aldrich is trying to argue that the terms of the note settlement were irregular, that he has cause to question the transaction. Can he do that? She asked. Her voice was very steady. The steadiness had become completely automatic now, a reflex. He can try. Judge Kramer is not his man, which is the one piece of luck in it. But it will take time and attention that I would rather be spending on other things. He met her eyes. And it will make things louder. She looked at him. This is my fault. It is not your fault. His voice was flat and absolute on this. No room in it for argument. He's using me against you. The arrangement was meant to protect me, and instead it's become a weapon pointed at your operation. And Evelyn, he leaned forward slightly, his forearms on the table. Listen to me. Harlan Aldrich has been trying to consolidate power in this region for a decade. I have been a problem for him for longer than you have. This situation, he would have manufactured something regardless. You didn't create this enemy. He already existed. He's just using you as the angle, because he calculated it would cause the most damage. He paused. He calculated wrong. She looked at him across the table. How? Because he thinks that what he says about you, what this town says about you, is going to make me step back from you. He thinks reputation and social pressure are the tools that move men like me. Something shifted in his face, the small shift she'd been learning to read, and this time it was bigger than usual. He doesn't understand that I am not moved by that. Then what moves you? Her voice was quiet. It was a question she hadn't planned to ask. It came out anyway, the way true things sometimes do. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hat on the table between them, and then he looked at her. You do, he said. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, Clara was somewhere in the yard with the chickens. The afternoon light was coming through the window and laying itself across the table in long lines. Evelyn sat with the words he had just said and felt them settle into the space where she'd been keeping everything locked and careful. Caleb, she said slowly, you should know what this costs you. What people will, I know what it costs, he said. I've been thinking about it for longer than you'd expect. He held her gaze. The question isn't the cost. The question is whether what's on the other side of it is worth it. He was quiet for a moment. I believe it is, she breathed. She looked at the man sitting across from her at the kitchen table in the house Thomas built. The man who had paid her for fair work and fought for her water rights, and bought her preserves, and showed up at her gate when he'd gotten bad news rather than carrying it alone. And she thought about what Marta Hensley had said about women in her position and what they were allowed to expect. She thought about Thomas, who had taught her that love didn't subtract from the person loved. That being seen, genuinely seen, was not a charity offered to someone lacking. It was the most honest gift one person could offer another. "I'm not an easy situation," she said. "I have a daughter and a farm with a debt attached, and a town that has already decided what it thinks about both of us. I am not simple, not defensive, not discouraged, and I am not going to." She stopped. "Started again. I won't be a decision you make out of a sense of obligation, or guilt, or because you feel sorry for what I've been through. That is not something I am willing to accept." He met her eyes and held them. "It isn't any of those things," he said. "I promise you that." She looked at him for a long, long moment. She was reading him the way she'd learned to read him, past the quiet exterior and into the deliberate honesty underneath. She found, as she had found every time she looked for falsehood in him, that there wasn't any. "I know," she said finally. "I believe you." The thing between them, the current beneath the still water, moved. She felt it move. He felt it too. She could see it in the careful way he was holding himself, like a man who has arrived at the edge of something significant and is waiting to be sure of the ground before he steps forward. Clara came in from the yard at that moment, as she always did at the least convenient times, with a chicken feather in her braid and her expression of total self-possession. She looked at Caleb. She looked at her mother. She looked at the coffee cups on the table. "Is there any of that left?" she asked, pointing at the pot. Evelyn blinked. "Almost 10, Clara said. And I've been outside working. Gathering feathers is not working. I helped with the chickens." Caleb made a sound that was unmistakably a laugh, brief, genuine, startled out of him. Both Evelyn and Clara turned to look at him, and he pressed his lips together and the corner of his mouth was doing the thing, and his eyes were warmer than Evelyn had seen them before. "You do smile," she said. "Mama said you did." Evelyn closed her eyes. "Clara," she said. "She said you smile in small ways," Clara continued with the enthusiasm of a child unencumbered by social self-preservation. "With the corner of your mouth." Evelyn opened her eyes and looked at the ceiling. "Is that true?" Clara asked Caleb. He looked at Evelyn. "The corner of his mouth was doing it right now. Your mother is very observant," he said. Clara looked at Evelyn. "I like him," she announced, as though delivering a verdict from the bench, and she went to her side of the curtain to put her things away. Evelyn looked at Caleb. He was looking at her with something that was past the almost smile, something open and unguarded in a way she hadn't seen on him before, and she felt the flutter in her chest do something she'd been refusing to let it do for weeks. "She has her father's directness," she said. "It's a quality I respect," he said. They looked at each other for a moment. Then Evelyn refilled his coffee, because she had run out of words for what was happening, and coffee was something she knew how to do. And Caleb accepted it, and wrapped both hands around the cup, and they sat together in the kitchen in the long afternoon light, and talked about his ranch and her garden, and Clara's reading primer, and the drought that might ease before September. And it was ordinary conversation, and it was the furthest thing from ordinary that Evelyn Harper had felt in 3 years. When he left later than he had come, later than either of them had noted, he paused at her gate and looked back at her on the porch. "I meant what I said," he told her, across the yard in the dusk. "I know," she said, "all of it. I know," she said again. And this time there was something in it that was not just acceptance but the beginning of something else. Something she hadn't allowed herself to name yet, because she was a cautious woman who had been hurt by naming things too early. But she thought, standing on her porch in the Montana dusk, that she might be ready to start. He rode away. She listened to the hoofbeats until she couldn't hear them, and then she went inside and told Clara to wash her hands for supper, and she stood at the stove and stirred the pot and let the feeling in her chest be what it was, finally. without trying to manage it into something safer. Outside, the summer was at last beginning to think about ending. The evenings were coming earlier. The heat still sat heavy on the land in the afternoons, but the mornings had developed a faint edge of something that wasn't quite cool, but was the memory of cool, the suggestion the season was shifting, that the worst of it was behind them. Something, she thought, was shifting, more than the season. She had been so focused on surviving Red Willow that she had not allowed herself to think about what surviving it might look like. What came after the endurance? What a woman rebuilt when she had finished protecting what she had, and could begin finally to want something more. The something more was sitting at her kitchen table 2 or 3 times a week now, drinking her coffee and working her fence and making her daughter laugh, and looking at her with dark, steady eyes that said he had already made his decision and was waiting, with perfect patience, for her to make hers. She was a cautious woman. She had reasons for caution that were real and earned and not going anywhere. But she was also, and this was newer, and more fragile, and more powerful than anything she'd felt in a very long time, a woman who had just begun to believe, against everything this town had told her, that she was worth wanting. Not in spite of what she was, not as an exception to what the world expected. Simply and entirely as herself, the woman, with the shovel and the cracked fence post and the iron spine and the cornbread and the daughter, who noticed everything and the laugh that surprised them both. She was worth wanting. She had forgotten that. She was remembering it now. And as the summer reached its last long weeks and the cottonwoods along the creek began their first subtle preparations for autumn, Evelyn Harper tended her garden and minded her farm and kept her accounts and helped her daughter with her primer. And she let Caleb Hawthorne sit at her table and drink her coffee and look at her the way he looked at her, and she let herself look back. Whatever was coming, and something was coming, she could feel it in the ground-level tension that Aldrich's silence had acquired. The particular quiet that precedes a storm rather than following one. She would face it the same way she had faced everything else. On her feet, with her chin up, and now for the first time with someone standing beside her. Part 3. The silence from Harlan Aldrich lasted 11 days. Evelyn counted them. Not because she was waiting for him, she told herself. She wasn't waiting for him, but because in her experience, silence from a man like Aldrich was never rest. It was preparation. And a woman who had learned to survive on a failing farm in a town that didn't want her to succeed had also learned to pay attention to what wasn't happening just as carefully as what was. 11 days. And then, on a Wednesday morning when the first real suggestion of autumn had finally arrived in the air, and Clara had gone to the schoolhouse, and Evelyn was alone at the farm working on the preserves she planned to bring. To the Saturday stall, she heard horses on the road. More than one. Moving with the particular kind of purpose that made her set down her jar and walk to the window. 3 riders. She didn't recognize 2 of them. The third was Pete Garrison, who worked as a kind of general agent for Aldrich, running errands, delivering messages, doing the things that Aldrich preferred not to attach his name to directly. They stopped at her gate. She dried her hands on her apron and went to the door and opened it before they had a chance to knock, which she did deliberately because she had learned that controlling the moment of confrontation mattered. "Mrs. Harper," Pete said from his horse. He had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable, which told her the message he was carrying was worse than usual. "Pete," she said, "Mr. Aldrich asked me to deliver something." He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. "For your review." She walked to the gate and took it from him without opening it. "What is it?" "I'm not at liberty to say, ma'am, Mr. Aldrich said you'd understand when you read it." She looked at the 2 men she didn't recognize. They were not ranch hands. They were something else, something with a legal quality to the way they sat their horses and looked at the property rather than at her. Assessing. "These men," she said. "Who are they?" Pete shifted in his saddle. "They're from the county assessor's office." Her blood went cold. She kept her face entirely still. "The assessor's office," she said. "Mr. Aldrich filed a property dispute with the county last week. These gentlemen are here to do a preliminary review of the land boundaries." Pete's discomfort had deepened. He was a man who understood he was being used as an instrument, and wasn't proud of it. "It's a legal matter, Mrs. Harper. I'm just the messenger." She looked at the envelope in her hand. She looked at the two men from the assessor's office. She looked at Pete Garrison, who could not quite hold her gaze. "A property dispute," she said quietly. "Yes, ma'am." "On what grounds?" "The paperwork will explain. On what grounds, Pete?" He swallowed. "Mr. Aldrich is claiming that the original survey of the Harper property's eastern boundary was recorded incorrectly. He says the water access point on the creek falls outside your legal property line." The words landed like stones dropped one at a time into still water. She stood and felt each one hit, the water access point. The creek, the water rights that Caleb had paid to protect. Aldrich wasn't coming at the note this time. He was going underneath it entirely. He was going after the land itself. "The assessor's men may look at the boundary markers from the road," she said. Her voice was perfectly level. She was distantly amazed at how level it was. "They may not enter the property without a court order. Pete, you tell Mr. Aldrich I've received his letter." "Mrs. Harper." "Good day," she said, and she turned and walked back into her house and closed the door and stood in the middle of her kitchen holding the envelope and breathing with great concentration until her hands stopped wanting to shake. Then she opened it. It was worse than Pete had described. Aldrich's lawyer, not the county assessor, his private lawyer. A man named Fletcher who operated out of Billings and who had a reputation for making things legally complicated until the other party ran out of money to fight, had drafted a formal challenge to the eastern boundary. Survey conducted when Thomas purchased the property. The claim was that the survey had been improperly recorded and that the actual legal boundary of the Harper property ran 12 feet west of where the markers had been placed, which would put the creek access entirely outside her land. If the claim held, the water rights were worthless. She would own land with no water access. In Montana in 1884, land with no water access was not a farm. It was a problem. She read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully along its original creases, put it on the kitchen table, and went to her fireplace and stood with her hand on the mantelpiece, looking at Thomas's photograph, the one taken the year before he died. Him squinting slightly against the sun, his hat pushed back, looking like a man entirely at home in his own life, and she said quietly, to the photograph, "I know. I know, I'm thinking." She went to Caleb, not because she couldn't handle it herself, but because she had made an agreement with him, and the agreement included keeping him informed of threats to the water rights, and this was exactly that. And she was no longer embarrassed to walk to a man's door with a problem when the problem was shared. That was a lesson she had been learning slowly, and was now prepared to apply. She walked the 2 miles to Hawthorne Ranch in the early afternoon, with the letter in her apron pocket and her chin level. The ranch was busy with its usual midday movement, hands moving between the barn and the corral, the sound of hammering from somewhere behind the main building. A hand she didn't know pointed her toward the south barn when she asked for Caleb, and she found him there working on a harness with the focused, economical movements of a man who does all things as though they deserve full attention. He looked up when she came in, read her face before she said anything. "Tell me," he said. She told him. She handed him the letter and watched him read it, and watched his expression do the thing it did when he was containing something, the jaw, the small tension around his eyes, the absolute stillness of the rest of his face. He read it once, folded it, looked at her. "He went after the survey," he said. "Yes, Fletcher drafted this." He said the lawyer's name with the particular flatness of someone who has encountered that name before in unpleasant circumstances. "Fletcher doesn't come cheap. Aldrich is spending real money on this." "Because he's angry," she said. "Because he's angry," Caleb agreed. "Which means he's not thinking as carefully as he usually does. Angry men make expensive mistakes." He handed her back the letter. "How old is the original survey?" "Thomas bought the property in 1878. The survey would have been done then. Who conducted it?" She thought. "I believe it was a man named Garrett. James Garrett. He was the county surveyor at the time." James Garrett is still living, Caleb said. He retired to Billings. He'll have copies of every survey he conducted. He looked at her directly. If his records show the boundary markers were placed correctly, and I have to believe they were, because Thomas Harper was not a careless man, then Fletcher's challenge falls apart. Can we get to Garrett before Aldrich does? Something moved in Caleb's expression. It might have been approval. That, he said, is exactly the right question. He sent a wire to Billings that afternoon. The reply came the next morning. James Garrett was in possession of his survey records and was prepared to provide a certified copy for a fee. He had not been contacted by anyone else. They had gotten there first. The relief that moved through Evelyn when Caleb showed her the wire was physical and immediate, and she was not ashamed of it. She sat in his ranch office. She had been there before, briefly, for the paperwork on the note, but this time she looked at the room and noticed things she hadn't the first time. The framed photograph on the desk that she was almost certain was Margaret, and chose not to look at directly. The worn quality of the chair where he clearly spent significant amounts of time. The stack of correspondence organized with a neatness that told her he was a man who knew where everything was. She sat in the chair across from his desk and felt the relief move through her and breathed. This buys us time, she said. It doesn't finish it. No, he agreed. Fletcher will look for another angle. But each angle he tries costs Aldrich money, and costs him time, and makes him look like a man pursuing a vendetta rather than a legitimate business claim. Judge Kramer, she said. Judge Kramer is a fair man. He paused. He's also a man who doesn't enjoy being used as a tool. When Aldrich first went to him about the note, he was cool about it. When he gets this property challenge across his desk, he'll be less happy. She nodded slowly. She was working through it, the way she worked through everything methodically, without rushing to conclusions she hadn't earned. You know this territory better than I do, she said. The legal landscape, the personalities. I've been operating here a long time. I know. She looked at him. You could have let Aldrich take the farm. It would have simplified your situation considerably. The water rights would have been a problem. Yes, but you have resources to manage it. You didn't have to. She stopped. You didn't have to make an enemy of him over me. He was looking at her with an expression that was doing considerable work. I didn't make an enemy of him over you, he said. He was already my enemy. I just stopped pretending otherwise. He paused. There's a difference. You say that a lot, she said. There's a difference. Because precision matters, he said. People tell themselves stories about their own reasons. I try not to. She looked at him for a moment. What story do you tell yourself about your reasons? He was quiet, not the evasive quiet of someone avoiding the question. The real quiet of someone taking the question seriously. That you deserve someone in your corner, he said. That I am capable of being that person, and that the question of what that looks like beyond a business arrangement is one I'm trying to give you space to decide without pressure from me. The air in the room was very still. You're giving me space, she said slowly. Trying to, he said. It's more difficult than I anticipated. She held his gaze and felt something she had been keeping at a careful distance take a step closer. She did not move it back. I appreciate that you're trying, she said. I also want you to know that the space is not. She stopped and reorganized. I'm not uncertain about you, Caleb. I'm uncertain about myself. About what I'm entitled to want. He leaned forward slightly. You're entitled to want everything, he said. I hope you know that. She held his gaze for a long moment, then she said, I'm beginning to. 3 days later, the second wave hit. She had known it was coming. She had known Aldrich would not stop at the property challenge, because the property challenge was moving too slowly for a man who operated on the principle that overwhelming force was more efficient than patience. What she had not anticipated was the specific form it would take. She heard about it from Tomas, who came to her farm on a Saturday morning, with a look on his young face that told her before he opened his mouth that he was carrying something he wished he wasn't. Mrs. Harper, he said. He had his hat in both hands. Mr. Hawthorne sent me. He's handling something at the ranch, and he didn't want you to hear this from someone else first." She put down what she was doing. "Tell me," Tomas told her. Aldrich had gone to Reverend Mills. Not the property dispute, not the bank, not the county assessor. The Reverend. He had requested a private meeting, and in that private meeting, he had presented what he called evidence she would find out. Later it was a letter, fabricated with enough surface plausibility to be convincing to a man who wanted to believe it, that Evelyn's relationship with Caleb Hawthorne had become improper. That the widow Harper was not the respectable woman the town had assumed, but a calculating one, who had manufactured her financial crisis to attract a wealthy man's attention, and was now conducting herself in a manner unbecoming of a Christian woman and unfit for the company of decent families. He had asked Reverend Mills to address it from the pulpit. Evelyn stood in her yard and listened to Tomas tell her this, and felt something move through her that was not grief, and was not anger, and was not fear. It was something colder and harder than any of those things. It was the feeling of a woman who has reached the particular threshold where there is simply nothing left to lose. "Did the Reverend agree?" she asked. Her voice was very quiet. Tomas swallowed. "I don't know, ma'am. Mr. Hawthorne went to speak with him this morning." She untied her apron. She folded it over the porch rail. She said, "Tell Mr. Hawthorne I've gone to speak with Reverend Mills myself." Tomas's eyes went wide. "Ma'am, Mr. Hawthorne thought it might be better if he—" "Tell him," she said, with a kindness but also with a finality that Tomas, to his credit, correctly identified as non-negotiable. She walked into town. She walked at a pace that was not running but was the next closest thing, and she walked with her chin up and her shoulders back. And she thought about Harlan Aldrich sitting across from Reverend Mills and telling lies about her, with the comfortable authority of a man who has always believed that wealth makes the truth whatever he decides it is. And she thought about the 3 years she had spent in this town, doing everything right and being looked at sideways anyway. And she thought about Clara, 9 years old, and growing up watching her mother be diminished. And something in her chest hardened into a resolution she had not known she possessed until this moment. She pushed open the door of the parsonage. Reverend Mills was a man in his late 60s, spare and serious, with a face that had been organized over decades into an expression of measured consideration. He was sitting at his desk when she entered, and across from him, already there, was Caleb. Both men looked up when she came in. Caleb's expression moved quickly through something surprise, then relief, then a kind of careful attention, as though he was reading the temperature of the room. She closed the door behind her and looked at Reverend Mills. "I understand Mr. Aldrich came to see you," she said. The Reverend folded his hands on the desk. "Mrs. Harper." "Please sit, I'll stand, thank you." She felt strangely, entirely calm. The kind of calm that only exists on the other side of everything you were afraid of. "Whatever he told you, I'd like the chance to respond to it directly. Not through intermediaries, directly." Reverend Mills looked at her for a long moment. He was, she had always thought, a better man than his social position sometimes required him to be. "Mr. Aldrich made certain claims about the nature of your relationship with Mr. Hawthorne," he said carefully. He presented what he described as correspondence that. "May I see it?" she said. A brief hesitation. Then Mills opened his desk drawer and placed a letter on the surface between them. She picked it up. She read it. It was written in a hand she didn't recognize and purported to be a note from her to Caleb, the language of it manufactured to suggest intimacy of the kind that would, in 1884, in a small Montana town, effectively destroy a woman's standing in her community. It was specific enough to be convincing to someone who didn't know her handwriting. It was also, she noted with cold precision, inaccurate in 3 details about her farm that anyone who had actually visited it would not have gotten wrong. She put it back on the desk. "That is not my handwriting," she said. "I can show you a dozen letters I've written to the bank, to suppliers, to the county land office, and you can compare them." "This is a fabrication." She held the Reverend's gaze. Mr. Aldrich had it written because he could not find an actual impropriety to present to you, because there has been no impropriety. Mr. Hawthorne and I have a business arrangement conducted with full transparency and witness documentation. Whatever personal regard we have developed, she paused, and felt Caleb go very still across the room, has been conducted with the respect and care of two people who have both experienced significant loss and are not inclined to treat any of this lightly. Reverend Mills looked at the letter, looked at her, looked at Caleb. Mr. Hawthorne, he said, is this consistent with your account? Yes, Caleb said, one word, absolute. The Reverend was quiet for a moment. He was the kind of man who thought before he spoke, which was, in Evelyn's current state, something she was profoundly grateful for. Mrs. Harper, he said finally, I want you to know that I had already decided, before you arrived, that I was not prepared to take this matter to the pulpit on the basis of Mr. Aldrich's word alone. He pushed the letter to the side of his desk. The man has a financial interest in your difficulty. That is not the foundation on which I conduct myself. Something released in her chest, not all of it, but some. Thank you, she said, however. He looked at her with a directness that was kind but unflinching. I would encourage you to be careful, not because I believe anything Aldrich claims, but because you are a widow woman in this town, and the standards applied to you are not fair ones, and what is fair and what is real are not always the same thing. He paused. I don't say that to discourage you. I say it because I have seen this town punish people for the appearance of impropriety when no impropriety existed, and I would not see that happen to you. She held his gaze. I appreciate your honesty, Reverend. She walked out of the parsonage and down the 2 steps and stood in the street, and Caleb came out behind her and stood beside her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. You didn't wait, he said finally. No, she said. I was handling it. I know you were. She turned to look at him. I didn't need it handled. I needed to handle it. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression was moving through several things at once. Yes, he said. I know that now. Do you mind? She asked, genuinely asking. He shook his head slowly, and the corner of his mouth did the thing. I mind the fact that it was necessary, he said. I don't mind you at all. She looked at him standing there in the street in Red Willow with his hat in his hands, and the September flight, and the warmth she'd been cataloging in the small shifts of his expression, now present, and unmistakable, and she thought, I am not afraid of this. I was afraid of it. I'm not anymore. What happened next happened fast, the way storms do in the open country, barely a warning before the full weight of it arrived. 2 days after the meeting with Reverend Mills, Aldrich made his most direct move. Not legal, not social, direct. He waited for a day when he knew Caleb was occupied the fall cattle count, which took the entire Hawthorne Ranch operation to the far pastures for a full day's work, and he arrived at the Harper farm in his own carriage, with Fletcher the lawyer, and 3 men she didn't recognize who were large in the specific way of men, hired to stand in places and communicate that leaving would be easier than staying. Clara was at school. Evelyn was alone. She watched them come through the gate from her porch, and she felt the first real thread of fear she had permitted herself in weeks, not for herself, but for what she was about to have to face, without Caleb 20 miles away, on the far pasture. Then she pushed the fear down, all the way down, stood up straight and put her hands in the pockets of her apron so nobody could see them, and walked to the top of the porch steps. Harlan, she said. Not Mr. Aldrich, Harlan deliberate. He stopped at the base of the steps and looked up at her, and he was not performing the gentlemanly patience of their previous interactions. He was done with performances. His face was hard and flat and entirely himself. I've run out of patience, he said. I think you know that. I know it, she said. Fletcher's going to keep filing challenges until you run out of money to fight them. The Garrett survey will hold, but I'll find another angle. I'm good at finding angles. He looked at her steadily. Caleb Hawthorne's not here today. I know where he is. And I want to be clear with you. Woman, too, he stopped himself, which was interesting. I want to be clear with you, because I think you're smart enough to understand plain speech. You've been fighting me for 3 years. You're tired. Your farm is barely surviving, and the man you've been leaning on has his own problems to deal with. Say what you came to say, she said. Sell me the farm, he said. Today. Right now. Fletcher's got the paperwork. I'll give you a fair price, better than fair, and you and the girl pack up and go somewhere else and start over. And none of this, he gestured at the legal proceedings. The whole grinding machinery of the past months, none of this was ever necessary. She looked at him. She looked at Fletcher with his leather case. She looked at the 3 large men standing slightly to the left. And she thought about Thomas, and the look on his face when he showed her this land, and the 6 years he'd worked to earn the money to buy it, and the 3 years she'd fought to keep it. And the September morning she'd stood at a collapsed irrigation ditch alone and told herself she could not give up. No, she said. Aldrich's face went through something. Evelyn, the answer is no. She met his eyes. It has always been no, and it will always be no, and the fact that you keep arriving here to ask it tells me more about you than it does about my situation. A man who has to take a farm from a widow by force is not a man who's in a position of strength. You're desperate, Harlan, and desperate men are dangerous, but they also make mistakes. Something went through his face, a flash of something she would have called fury if she'd been less careful about naming things. You're going to regret this, he said. I regret a great many things, she said. Choosing to stay on my land has never been one of them. He stared at her, and then he turned and nodded to Fletcher and walked back to his carriage, and the 3 men moved with him, and Fletcher looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't read, and then followed. She stood on the porch and watched them leave. She stood there for a long time after the carriage was gone, with the sound of the September wind in the cottonwoods and her own heartbeat loud in her ears. And she did not allow herself to shake until she had gone inside and sat down and put her face in her hands and breathed. Just breathed. She was still sitting at the kitchen table when she heard hoofbeats. She looked up. Through the window, she could see a rider coming from the direction of the ranch road hard, faster than Caleb usually rode, and she recognized the horse before she recognized the man, and she was at the door before he'd even dismounted. He swung down and covered the distance from her porch in 6 strides and stopped at the base of the steps and looked at her face, and she watched him process what he saw in it. He was here, Caleb said. He was here. I'm fine. She met his eyes. How did you know? Tomas came back for a tool and saw the carriage on the road. He mounted the first porch step. His face was doing something she hadn't seen on it before, something uncontrolled, something raw at the edges. He rode out to find me. I came straight back. He was looking at her with an intensity that she felt in her sternum. What did he do? He asked me to sell. She looked at him steadily. I said no. Caleb's jaw worked. You were alone. I was. You shouldn't have been. He was 2 steps from her now, close enough that she could see the dust from the hard ride still on his coat, close enough that the rawness in his expression was unmistakable. I should have had someone here. I shouldn't have. Caleb, she said his name and he stopped. She looked at him directly. I handled it. His voice was rough. That's not the point. Then what is the point? He looked at her, and something in his face gave way, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that a dam gives way when the water has been pressing long enough, a crack and then an opening and then something that cannot be closed again. The point, he said, is that I don't want you to have to handle it alone. Not anymore, not ever again. The air between them went very still. Caleb, she began. I know the timing is wrong, he said, and he didn't step back, didn't retreat into the careful distance he'd been maintaining. I know you need time, and I know I said I'd give you space, and I intend to keep giving it to you. But I need you to understand something. He looked at her with those dark, steady eyes, the ones she had been reading for weeks, the ones that she now knew were the most honest part of him. I rode 20 miles in 40 minutes because the thought of you facing that man alone, because the thought of anything happening to you. He stopped. Reorganized. I am not neutral about you, Evelyn. I haven't been neutral about you for a long time. She looked at him standing on her porch step, with the dust on his coat and the rawness in his face and the whole honest weight of what he'd just said filling the space between them. And she thought about all the ways she had been preparing herself for something like this, and all the ways preparation turned out to be entirely inadequate when the thing actually arrived. "I know," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "I'm not neutral about you either." Something moved across his face. "Evelyn, I'm scared," she said. Because she was, and because she had decided that the honest thing was the only thing worth doing anymore. "Not of you, of what it means, of what people will say. Of whether I deserve," she stopped. "Of whether this is real." He came up the last step. He was standing directly in front of her now, and he reached out and took her hands, both of them, her work-ruthened, calloused, shovel-hardened hands, and held them in his, which were the same, and looked at her with an expression she felt like a hand pressed over the place, where she kept everything she'd been protecting. "It's real," he said, "and you deserve it. And I don't care what this town says, Evelyn." "I never have," he held her gaze. "The only opinion I care about is yours." She looked down at their joined hands. She looked up at his face. She thought about Thomas, who had also held her hands like they were worth holding, and she felt the grief of that, and the grace of this simultaneously, and she let both of them be true. "All right," she said softly. "All right," he repeated. "All right," she said again, and for the first time in a long, long time, she let herself lean, just slightly, just enough, into the solid and certain presence of someone who intended to stay. He did not move away. He held her hands and looked at her, and the September wind moved through the cottonwoods, and somewhere down the road a door closed and a dog barked, and the whole ordinary world continued exactly as it had, indifferent and unhurried, while everything in Evelyn Harper's life shifted on its foundation and resettled into a shape she had stopped believing was possible. And then Clara's voice came from the gate. She was home from school, arriving with her lunch pail and her satchel, and her complete lack of any social self-preservation. "Mama, Mr. Hawthorne's horse is here. Is he staying for supper?" And both of them looked toward the gate, and then at each other, and Caleb's expression broke open into the full smile she had never seen before. Not the corner, not the almost, the actual real thing. And it was so unguarded and so genuine that Evelyn felt it like sunlight on a cold morning. "Is he?" Clara demanded from the gate, entirely unaware of the continent that had just shifted beneath her feet. Evelyn looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Evelyn. "I reckon that depends on Mrs. Harper," he said. Evelyn looked at her daughter, then back at the man standing on her porch step, with her hands in his and his full and genuine smile, and 6 years of careful solitude opening like a fist that has finally decided to let go. She said, and he did. Part 4. Caleb stayed for supper that night, and the next night, and the one after that, and somewhere in the space of those 3 evenings, the shape of things between them changed, in a way that neither of them announced, because neither of them needed to. It was simply present, the way he moved through her kitchen without bumping into her, the way Clara talked to him now, as though he had always been at the table, the way Evelyn found herself cooking with someone in mind for the first time in 3 years instead of calculating the minimum necessary to keep herself and her daughter fed. It was not without its complications. Nothing in Evelyn Harper's life had ever been without complications. The town had noticed. Of course the town had noticed. Red Willow noticed everything, cataloged everything, held everything up to the particular harsh light of community judgment that small places reserve for the private lips of people who have not asked for scrutiny and are going to receive it regardless. Caleb's horse tied at her gate in the evenings was a fact that traveled from one end of Main Street to the other by the following morning each time. She heard the murmur of it. She felt the redirected gazes when she came into town, the conversations that lowered a register at her approach, the looks that were made of equal parts disapproval, and a reluctant curiosity that the disapproval couldn't quite smother. She kept her chin level and her spine straight, and she let them look. But the morning that changed things, the morning that moved everything from private current to public reckoning, came on a Tuesday in early October, 3 weeks after Caleb had stayed for supper, and Clara had gone to sleep, and they had sat together on the porch in the first real cool of autumn and talked until nearly midnight, and he had ridden home in the dark with the kind of reluctance that does not require words to communicate. She was at the Saturday market stall, the one that had recovered since Caleb began purchasing regularly, and since 2 other ranches had followed his lead, apparently deciding that if Hawthorne vouched for the Harper preserves, there was a quality argument to be made when Marta Hensley arrived with Patricia Cole, who ran the women's auxiliary at the church, and 3 other women whose names Evelyn knew and whose approval she had long since stopped seeking. She saw them coming. She had time to identify the specific formation, 5 women moving together. Patricia Cole at the front, with the expression of someone who has appointed herself the instrument of community conscience, and to understand what it meant before they arrived at her stall. Evelyn, Patricia said. She was a tall, angular woman whose fundamental decency was perpetually at war with her enthusiasm for social management, and today the social management side had clearly won. "We thought it was time to speak with you directly." "About what?" Evelyn said. She continued wrapping a jar of blackberry preserves for the woman who'd been buying from her. "About this situation with Caleb Hawthorne. My business arrangements with Mr. Hawthorne are a matter of record," she said pleasantly. She handed the wrapped jar to her customer and thanked her. "It isn't the business arrangements we're concerned about," Marta said, and her voice had the particular quality of a woman who has convinced herself she is speaking for the greater good. "It's the regularity of his presence at your farm." "In the evenings, Evelyn, people see his horse, people talk." "People do," she agreed. "Is there something specific you'd like to say to me, Patricia, or is this a general advisory?" Patricia drew herself up. "We think as women who have your welfare at heart." "Do you?" A brief pause. "We think that you should consider how this looks. You're a widow. He's a single man of considerable means. Whatever your intentions, my intentions," Evelyn said, "are to run my farm, raise my daughter, and conduct my personal life according to my own conscience." She looked at Patricia directly. "I don't recall asking for a committee's input on any of those things." Marta made a small wounded sound. "We're trying to help." "I know you believe that," Evelyn said, and she was surprised to find that she genuinely did. That under the social posturing and the judgment there was a real, if misguided, concern that she did not want to dismiss entirely, because dismissing it entirely would make her the kind of person she didn't want to be. "But helping me would look different from this. Helping me would have looked different 3 years ago, when I was carrying water buckets alone, and repairing fences alone, and raising my daughter alone, and all of you watched and said nothing." She held Patricia's gaze steadily. "What Caleb Hawthorne and I are to each other is between us. I'll thank you to leave it there." She turned back to her stall. There was a moment of charged silence behind her, and then she heard the 5 women move away, and she kept her hands busy and her face forward, and she was very nearly proud of herself. What she was not prepared for was the figure standing at the edge of the market square, who had been there long enough to hear most of what she'd said. Caleb. He had come to town for supplies, and he had not announced himself because he hadn't expected to find her in the middle of it, and he was standing with his hat in his hands and an expression that she had never seen on him before. She walked over to him. "How much did you hear?" she asked. "Enough," he said. His voice was very quiet. He looked at her with something in his face that was not quite pain and not quite wonder, and was something in between that she didn't have a name for yet. "You didn't back down." "No, they're not the easiest women in this town to say no to." "No," she agreed. He was still looking at her with that expression. "Evelyn," he said. "Don't make it into something it isn't," she said. "I'm tired of backing down. That's all it was." "That is not all it was," he said. "That was you standing in the middle of a market square in front of the most socially powerful women in Red Willow and telling them clearly and without apology that your life is yours." He paused. "That was one of the bravest things I've ever seen." She looked at him for a moment. "You've seen cattle drives and blizzards and a man hold a property together alone for 6 years. None of it was braver than what you just did," he said simply. She felt the warmth of it move through her and didn't try to argue it away. "Come have coffee," she said. "I'm almost done here." He sat at her table 2 hours later with the familiar ease of a man who knows a kitchen well and does not feel the need to be a guest in it. And Clara was doing her school lessons at the other end of the table, and the afternoon light was coming through the window and laying itself across everything in long warm lines, and it felt so natural, the four-sided quality of it. Him and her and Clara and the kitchen, that Evelyn had to stop herself for a moment and register what she was actually inhabiting. Not survival, not endurance, something that had the weight and texture of the life she had been afraid to want. "I need to tell you something," Caleb said. She looked at him. His voice had the specific quality of a man who has been working up to a sentence. "I heard from Judge Kramer's office this morning," he said. "Fletcher has withdrawn the property challenge." She went still. "What?" Dropped it. He watched her face. "James Garrett submitted his certified survey records last week. The boundary markers are exactly where they've always been." Fletcher looked at the documentation and told Aldrich the challenge wouldn't survive a hearing. He paused. Aldrich cut his losses. The relief was enormous and immediate, and was followed so closely by suspicion that the two feelings overlapped. "He doesn't cut his losses," she said. "No," Caleb agreed. "He doesn't. I went to see him," Caleb said. She looked at him. He held her gaze. "Before I knew Fletcher had withdrawn, I went to his office and I sat across from him and I told him clearly what I was prepared to do if he continued to pursue you through legal channels or social channels or any other channel." He paused. "I was not subtle about it. What did you tell him?" "I told him that I have been patient because I believed the legal process would work, and I still believe that, but that my patience with a man who manufactures evidence and employs lawyers to harass a widow was not without limits. I told him that I had more resources than he did for a prolonged legal fight and more friends on the county commission than he had calculated, and that every move he made against you I would answer with 3 of my own." He looked at her steadily. "And I told him that whatever he thought about the situation between us, whatever assumptions he had made about what I felt, and whether it was real, he had made them wrong, and he should adjust his calculations accordingly." She was quiet for a moment. "You told him about us?" "I told him you were not alone," he said, "and that he should plan accordingly." Across the table, Clara had stopped pretending to do her lessons. She was watching them with the full focused attention of a child who understands that something important is happening and has decided that the lessons can wait. Evelyn looked at Caleb. She looked at Clara's watching face. She looked back at Caleb. "Was that wise?" she asked. "Probably not," he said. "I don't particularly care." Clara said, very clearly, from her end of the table, "I think it was brave." Both adults looked at her. Like Mom at the market square, Clara continued, entirely undeterred. "Sometimes you have to just say the thing." Caleb looked at Evelyn. The corner of his mouth was doing the thing, but bigger than usual. "Your daughter makes an excellent point. My daughter," Evelyn said, "is going to finish her lessons." Clara picked up her pencil with the serene expression of someone who has already made her contribution to the proceedings and is content to let events unfold. The October that followed was different from any month Evelyn could remember since before Thomas died. Not because the work lessened, it never did. The farm made the same relentless demands on her body and her time that it always had. But something had changed in the texture of it. She was not carrying it alone. Not the weight of the work, and not the weight of being seen a certain way by a town that had decided what she was and could not quite account for the fact that she kept contradicting their accounting. Caleb came by most evenings. Not all of them. He had a ranch to run that was, in October, occupied with the full business of fall preparation, and she had her own work to tend and her own need to stand on her own ground, but most of them. He ate at her table and sat on her porch and talked with Clara about her lessons and her chickens and the book she was working through. And he fixed things around the farm, not because she couldn't, but because 2 pairs of hands moved faster than one, and he was there, and the thing needed fixing. She stopped arguing about it after the 3rd time, and he stopped looking like he expected her to argue. and they arrived somewhere that was less careful and more honest and considerably warmer than where they had started. She was learning him. The way he thought through problems out loud when he trusted the person he was with. The way he went quiet when he was carrying something he hadn't yet decided how to put down. The way he looked at Clara sometimes with an expression that was so completely unguarded she had to look away from it because it made her chest ache, with something she wasn't ready to name yet. She was also slowly and imperfectly learning how to accept what was being offered. That was the harder part. 3 years of managing alone had built a kind of structural independence in her that was both her greatest strength and she was discovering. Also a wall she'd built so high she'd forgotten what it was keeping out, along with what it was keeping safe. She'd catch herself explaining why she didn't need help with a thing before she'd even been offered it. She'd hear the defensive note in her own voice when he made a suggestion about the farm, and would have to stop and identify where the defensiveness was coming from, not from him, who had never once made her feel inadequate, but from herself. From 3 years of a town telling her she was inadequate, and her decision to prove them wrong, becoming so deeply habitual that she didn't always know when to put it down. She told him this one evening, stumbling over it somewhat, because it was not the kind of thing she was accustomed to saying out loud. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she had come to rely on, his quality of full, undivided attention when she was speaking. He did not offer solutions. He did not reassure her prematurely. He just listened until she had finished, and then he said, "I know." "You've noticed?" "Yes." He paused. "I've also noticed that it's getting better." She looked at him. "Is it? You let me fix the south gate without arguing last Thursday," he said with the particular gravity of a man making a serious point. That was a significant development. She laughed. The real laugh, the one that still surprised her with its own existence. "I was tired," she said. "You were ready," he said gently. The first frost came in mid-October, earlier than usual, arriving overnight without warning and covering the ground with a thin, brittle white that cracked under her boots when she went out in the morning. She stood on the porch and looked at it and thought about the garden, what had been harvested, what hadn't, what would survive and what wouldn't. And she was still doing that calculation when she heard Caleb's horse. He came early, before 7. He had his work coat on and his breath was visible in the cold air, and he looked at her face and said, "Garden?" "The squash might be all right," she said. "The last of the beans are probably gone." "Show me." They went to the garden together and assessed the damage, which was less than she'd feared and more than she'd hoped, which was usually how damage worked. He helped her harvest what could still be harvested, and she worked beside him in the early morning cold, both of them breathing visible in the sharp air. And at some point, she looked up from what she was doing and found him watching her with that expression, the open, unguarded one that she had first seen on his porch, and that still, weeks later, made her feel like something she had been protecting finally had permission to breathe. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said, but he didn't look away. "Caleb." He set down what he was carrying. He straightened and looked at her across the frost-killed garden, with the whole cold October morning around them. "I've been thinking," he said, "about how to say something." She set down what she was carrying. "I've been thinking about it for a while," he continued. "About the right time and the right way and whether you were ready to hear it, and whether I was ready to say it." He paused. "I've come to the conclusion that there isn't a right time. There's just the time you're in, and the time I'm in is right now, and I think you're ready. Because I think you're one of the readiest people I've ever met. You just don't always know it." She looked at him. "Say it," she said. He came around the edge of the garden. He came to where she was standing, and he stopped in front of her, and took off his hat and held it in both hands, and looked at her with everything. He had no careful distance, no managed expression. All of it just present and honest and absolutely real. "Marry me," he said. The word landed in the cold morning air and hung there. She stared at him. "Not because you need saving," he said rapidly, because he had clearly prepared for the objections and wanted to address them before she could raise them. Not because of the farm or the water rights or Aldrich or any of the practical reasons that started all of this. Those reasons exist and they're real and they matter, but they are not the reason I'm standing in your frost gardens at 7 in the morning asking you this. He held her gaze. The reason is you. Specifically and entirely you, the woman who repaired her own fence in July heat and told the county assessor's men to stay on the road and faced down Harlan Aldrich alone on her porch and stood in the middle of a market square and told 5 women. Her life was her own. His voice was steady but not entirely controlled. The woman who makes cornbread for a daughter she loves and reads primers at a kitchen table and shakes alone when she thinks nobody is watching. Something in his expression went completely open. I've watched you carry this for 3 years, Evelyn. I want to stand beside you for the rest of it. That's all I'm asking. She looked at him in the frost-killed garden in the cold October morning in Red Willow, Montana, and felt everything she had been keeping at a careful distance for 3 years arrive all at once, the grief and the hope and the fear and the something else, the something that had been growing since July without asking her permission. The something that felt like ground under her feet after years of managing on uncertain footing. She thought about Thomas. She thought about his photograph on the mantelpiece and the look on his face when he showed her this land and the way he held her hands like they were worth holding. She thought about grief and whether accepting happiness was a betrayal of it or whether it was, in fact, exactly what a man like Thomas would have wanted for the woman he loved. She already knew the answer. She had known it for a while. Clara, she said. He blinked. Yes, she's going to have opinions, Evelyn said. About all of it. The ranch, the house, where she sleeps, what she's allowed to name the animals. She's going to be extremely thorough about all of her opinions. Something shifted in his face, the almost smile graduating again. I expect she will, he said carefully. You're going to have to learn to negotiate with a 9-year-old, she said. She's better at it than most adults, Evelyn. His voice was low and warm and entirely unsteady in a way she had never heard from him before. Are you saying yes? She looked at him. This man who had paid her for fair work and settled her note and come 20 miles in 40 minutes because the thought of her facing something alone was more than he could stand. This man who listened to her with full attention and told her the truth without decoration and laughed when Clara said unexpected things and fixed her south gate without making her feel like it meant she couldn't have fixed it herself. I'm saying yes, she said, Caleb. I'm saying yes. He put his hat back on with hands that were not entirely steady, and he covered the remaining distance between them, and he took her hands exactly the way he had on the porch in September, both of them, all of them. Her work-ruthened, capable hands and held them, and looked at her with the full and unguarded smile that was still so new she hadn't finished cataloging it. All right, he said. All right, she laughed. It rose up from somewhere below the careful management, and the 3 years of endurance and the careful distancing she'd maintained from everything she was afraid to want, and it was full and real and warm in the cold morning air. Clara's voice came from the direction of the house she had woken and not found her mother and come looking. Appearing at the garden gate in her nightgown, with her dark hair loose and her serious eyes moving between the 2 adults standing close together in the frost. What's happening? She demanded. Evelyn and Caleb looked at each other. Then they looked at Clara. Come here, sweetheart, Evelyn said. Clara came into the garden in her bare feet on the frost, which was going to require a dressing, and stopped in front of them and looked up at Caleb, and then at her mother with the focused assessment of a child, taking the full measure of a situation. Mr. Hawthorne asked me to marry him, Evelyn said. Clara looked at Caleb. What did you say? She asked, but she was asking her mother. I said yes. Clara was quiet for a full 5 seconds, which from Clara was a significant duration. She looked at Caleb. Are you going to be my father? She asked. Caleb went very still for a moment. Then he crouched down to Clara's level and looked at her with the unguarded expression that Evelyn had first noticed and never stopped noticing. I'd like to try, he said, if you'll let me. Clara studied him. Do you know how to do the braid? She asked. The one Mama does in the mornings? Caleb looked up at Evelyn briefly, then back at Clara. I don't, he said, but I can learn. Clara considered this with the full gravity of a judge weighing substantial evidence. All right, she said at last. You can try. Evelyn looked at the two of them, her daughter in her nightgown in the frost with her bare feet. This man crouched down at Clara's level, with all his careful solitude opening, like a hand finally releasing something it had been holding for too long, and she felt the specific fullness of a moment that knows itself to be important. That has the quality of something you will carry forwarded, and take out occasionally and look at, because it was the moment when the thing you had stopped believing in came back. That afternoon, when Clara was at school, and Caleb had gone back to the ranch to see to his business, Evelyn sat at her kitchen table and wrote a letter. Not to a lawyer or a bank or a county official, to her sister in Ohio, whom she had not written to properly in over a year, because the proper truth of her life had been too heavy to put in an envelope and send somewhere. She wrote the whole of it, the farm and the bank note and Caleb and the market square and the frost-killed garden and the proposal. She wrote about Clara saying all right in her nightgown, with her bare feet in the frost. She wrote about Thomas too, about what she thought he would have made of all of it, which was that he would have liked Caleb enormously, and would have been insufferably smug about being right that she was worth choosing. She wrote until the afternoon light shifted and the stove needed tending, and then she folded the letter and sealed it and put it in her apron pocket and went back to her life, which was fuller than it had been the morning before, and was going to keep getting fuller, and was hers, all of it hers, and she was not afraid of it anymore. The announcement moved through Red Willow the way all announcements did, faster than anyone sent it, arriving before the people involved had quite caught their breath. By the following morning, it was confirmed fact from one end of Main Street to the other. By afternoon, the reactions had organized themselves into camps, the genuinely happy, the performatively surprised, and the small but vocal contingent that had apparently been saving their disapproval for exactly this occasion. Marta Hensley was at the general store when Evelyn came in for supplies the day after the announcement. And for one long moment they stood facing each other across the counter, and Evelyn watched Marta make a decision about what kind of woman she wanted to be. Marta put out her hand. "Congratulations," she said. It was imperfect. It had the quality of something being worked on rather than something complete. But it was offered, and Evelyn took it, because she was also the kind of woman who could receive an imperfect thing if it was offered honestly. "Thank you, Marta," she said. Harold Bishop was less gracious. He said, loud enough for 3 people to hear, that Hawthorne had lost his senses and that the town would see the consequences of it soon enough. She heard this and did not respond to it because Harold Bishop's opinion occupied no meaningful space in her life, and she was done allocating room for things that added nothing. What she was not prepared for was Harlan Aldrich. He came to her. Not to her farm this time. He came to the general store, which was the one public space where she could not simply close a gate, and he arrived while she was there, and he stopped in front of her and looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read. He looked, she thought, with some surprise, tired. "I heard," he said. "I imagine most people have. He stopped. He was not a man accustomed to whatever sentence he was attempting. "The property challenge is withdrawn. The bank matter is settled. I don't intend to pursue further action against the farm." He said this to the middle distance rather than directly to her. "That's all." She looked at him for a moment. "Is that an apology?" "It's a statement of my intentions," he said. "All right," she said. "I'll take it as that." He nodded once and left. She stood watching him go and thought that there was probably a version of Harlan Aldrich who had not spent 30 years deciding that what was his was everything he could take, and that version might have been a decent enough man. And she felt something very small and entirely unexpected, which was the faint beginning of something that was not forgiveness, but was the precondition for it. She would not forget what he had done, but she was going to build a life large enough that the space it occupied in her memory would continue to shrink. That seemed like the right use of her energy. Caleb arrived that evening, and she told him about Aldrich, and he listened with his full attention, and then he said he backed down because he ran the numbers and we won. "That's all it was, maybe," she said. "Don't spend too much goodwill on him," Caleb said. Not harshly, just directly. "I'm not," she said. "I'm spending it on myself." She looked at him across the kitchen table. "On us." The word sat between them, small and domestic and entirely enormous. Caleb looked at it. She could see him receive it, and something in his face went warm in the way it did now, more often than not. The way she was beginning to simply expect from him rather than mark as exceptional. "On us," he repeated. "On us," she said. Outside, October was deepening into itself, the cold settling in with the seriousness it meant to keep all winter. Inside, the kitchen was warm, and Clara was doing her lessons, and the coffee was on, an Evelyn Harper widow, farmer. The woman everyone had watched suffer in silence and looked away from was sitting at her own table in her own house with the man she had chosen and the daughter she had raised and a future she had. Spent 3 years telling herself was too much to want. It was not too much. It had never been too much. It was exactly and precisely enough. Part 5. They were married on a Saturday in November, 3 weeks after the frost-killed garden and the proposal and Clara's barefoot verdict in her nightgown. Evelyn had not wanted a large ceremony. She had wanted something real, which in her experience was almost always smaller than what other people thought it should be. Reverend Mills performed the service in the church with perhaps 30 people present the hands from Hawthorne Ranch. A handful of townspeople who had arrived without being invited, because that was what people in Red Willow did. Clara in her best dress with her dark hair, braided in the way Evelyn had done it every morning for 9 years, and would she supposed teach Caleb to do it now. He had asked her, the evening before the wedding, to show him how, and she had stood behind Clara at the kitchen table, with Caleb watching, with the focused attention he brought to everything, and she had walked him through it step by step. And he had practiced twice, and the second time was considerably better than the first. And Clara had said, with the judicial authority that was her primary mode of engagement with the world, "That will do." Caleb had looked at Evelyn over Clara's head with an expression that said he had just passed something more important than he'd expected. The ceremony itself was brief and honest. Reverend Mills spoke about endurance and hope and the specific grace of two people who have both survived loss finding their way to each other. And Evelyn stood beside Caleb in the church with her hands in his and her daughter at her side and felt the particular quality of a moment that is exactly what it needs to be, not more, not decorated, not performed. Just real. When Mills asked if there was any cause why the two should not be joined, and the church was quiet for a full 5 seconds. Clara looked around the room with an expression of such complete personal authority that 2 people in the third pew visibly reconsidered whether they had any thoughts on the matter and decided they didn't. Evelyn heard someone she thought it was Tom Briggs, the oldest hand at Hawthorne Ranch. A man who had known Caleb for 15 years, make a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a cry, and was the sound of a person watching something good happen to someone who has earned it. Caleb said his vows in a voice that was even and deliberate and completely unsteady, in a way that only she was close enough to hear. She said hers the same way. When Mills pronounced them married, and Caleb looked at her with the full and unguarded expression that she had been learning for months and was still learning, she thought, "I will spend the rest of my life learning this face." And the thought was not frightening. It was the most settled thing she had felt in years. They moved to Hawthorne Ranch 2 weeks after the wedding. The moving was its own kind of reckoning. Evelyn had been in the Harper farmhouse for 6 years, and it held Thomas in every board and nail of it, and leaving it was not simple, and she did not pretend that it was. She packed methodically and carefully, the way she did everything. And she took what mattered and donated what didn't, and she stood in the empty kitchen on the last morning, and let herself grieve it properly, not in a way that was the same as grieving Thomas. Because the grief of a place is a different texture from the grief of a person, but real and deserving of acknowledgement. Caleb found her there. He came in without announcing himself, the way he'd been doing for months, and stood in the doorway of the empty kitchen and looked at her standing in the middle of it, with her hands at her sides and her face doing the thing she usually kept private. "Take the time you need," he said. She looked at him. "We have a wagon waiting. The wagon can wait," he said. She looked at the empty kitchen for another long moment. She thought about the cornbread she'd made in this kitchen at 5 in the morning, because making something was the only way to keep moving. She thought about the table where she'd signed papers with Caleb and argued with Aldrich and paid bills and taught Clara her letters. She thought about Thomas building this room with his own hands and the pride in his face when he'd shown her the finished plank floor. "All right," she said, to the kitchen and to Thomas and to herself. "All right." She walked out. Caleb held the door and she went through it, and she didn't look back, because looking back was something she had earned the right to stop doing. The ranch house was large and had been silent for 6 years, and it knew it, the way houses know the quality of what they've been holding. The first time Evelyn walked through it with Clara, the morning after they arrived, she felt the particular echo of a space that had been maintained but not inhabited, everything clean, everything in order, nothing out of place, and nothing warm. Clara walked through every room with her hands behind her back and her chin slightly elevated in the manner of a magistrate conducting an official inspection. She said nothing for a long time. Then she stopped in the largest of the upstairs bedrooms and looked at Caleb, who was following at a respectful distance. "This one," Clara said. Caleb looked at the room. "That one is yours if you want it." "I want it," Clara said. It was not a negotiation. It was a conclusion. "All right," Caleb said, with the equanimity of a man learning that his household now included a 9-year-old senior partner. Evelyn looked at him over Clara's head. He looked back at her. The corner of his mouth. Within a week, Clara had organized the kitchen according to a logic that Evelyn had spent a decade developing, and that Caleb, who had apparently been storing things in the ranch kitchen, according to a system that could be generously described as approximate, had never encountered. He came in the second morning and opened a cabinet looking for something, and found it had been moved, and stood looking at the new arrangement for a moment. "Clara did this?" he asked. "Clara did this," Evelyn confirmed. "There's a system. There's always been a system. You just didn't know it." He looked at the cabinet. Then he closed it and said with complete seriousness, "I think the system is probably better." It was that, she thought, the ordinary texture of it. The cabinet and the morning coffee and the hands at the long table and the particular rhythm of a house becoming a home, it was that which was the real miracle. Not the grand moments, not the confrontations and the legal victories and the proposal in the frost-killed garden. Those were real and they had mattered. But this, the daily accumulation of ordinary things done together, this was what she had been surviving toward without knowing it. The ranch hands adjusted to her presence with the particular mixture of wariness and curiosity that characterized men encountering a change in an environment they had considered stable. She had expected some resistance. What she had not expected was how quickly it resolved itself, and she understood why only gradually. They had been watching Caleb Hawthorne be a closed and solitary man for 6 years, and they had witnessed what it cost him. And the woman who had opened something in him that they had stopped believing could be opened was not going to receive their resistance. She was going to receive their loyalty, because she had earned his, and he was the man they had followed into blizzards and droughts and difficult seasons for 15 years. Tomas was the first to call her Mrs. Hawthorne. He did it on her 3rd morning at the ranch, handing her a basket of eggs from the henhouse, and he said it with a directness that told her it was a deliberate choice and not an accident. She thanked him, and he went back to his work, and she stood with the basket and felt the name settle over her like something that had been made for that exact shape. She kept the Harper farm. She had been clear about that in the conversations before the wedding, and Caleb had been equally clear that he had never expected otherwise. They leased the land to a young couple from the next county, who arrived in January with a baby and considerable determination and very little experience. And Evelyn spent 3 mornings with the wife, a girl named Rose who was 22, and afraid of exactly the right things, and not afraid of enough other things walking her through the irrigation, the winter garden, the quirks of the soil on the east side, the way the creek ran in dry years. Rose was looking at her with something close to reverence by the 3rd morning, which made Evelyn uncomfortable, because reverence was never the right response to practical information. "I'm not telling you anything exceptional," Evelyn said. "I'm telling you what I learned by failing at it first." "How did you not give up?" Rose asked. Evelyn thought about it seriously, the way the question deserved. "I didn't have the luxury of giving up," she said. "I had a daughter," and then she paused, "and then I had someone who refused to look away." Rose looked at her. "Eventually," Evelyn said. "He started by just not looking away. From the beginning, even when it wasn't his business. He saw me, and being seen made it harder to stop." She paused. "That sounds smaller than it is." "It doesn't sound small," Rose said. The winter passed. It was a hard winter, the way Montana winters always were, but hard in a way that was shared now, carried between more than one set of hands, and that changed the weight of it, fundamentally. Caleb was up before her most mornings, and she woke to the sound of him already moving through the house and felt, each time, the specific relief of not being the only one awake in the dark. She had not known she was tired of being the only one awake in the dark until she was no longer that. The twist that no one had expected came in February. Not from Aldrich, who had retreated into a silence that was either genuine defeat or long preparation, and which Evelyn had decided to treat as the former for the sake of her own peace. Not from the town, which had largely reorganized itself around the fact of their marriage, with the pragmatic adaptability of a community that prefers current events to ongoing conflict. It came from Clara. Clara, who had arrived at Hawthorne Ranch with her lunch pail and her serious eyes and her complete certainty about the bedroom she wanted, had been conducting herself for 4 months with the equilibrium of a child who has made her assessment and found the situation acceptable. She was doing well at school. She had named 3 of the barn cats, which Caleb had quietly allowed on the grounds that the cats needed names, and Clara had better reasons for the ones she chose than any he could have managed. She called Caleb by his first name, which he had told her she was welcome to, and she called him that with the ease of a child who has decided on her terms and is comfortable with them. And then on a Sunday evening in February, sitting at the kitchen table with her lesson spread in front of her, and the stove going, and Caleb across from her, working through the ranch accounts and Evelyn at the counter, Clara said, without preamble, without looking up from her primer, "Can I call you Papa?" The kitchen went very still. Caleb's pencil stopped moving. Evelyn turned from the counter and looked at her daughter. Clara was looking at Caleb now, with the direct and serious and entirely unafraid expression that she had brought to every significant moment, since she was old enough to have significant moments. And she was waiting with the particular patience of a child who has asked an important question and is prepared for any answer. Caleb set his pencil down. He looked at Clara for a long moment, one of those full, complete looks that he brought to things that mattered, and Evelyn watched his face do something she had never seen it do before. Not the corner of the mouth, not the managed expression. Something that went all the way through him, reaching somewhere deep and old that had been closed for a very long time. "Yes," he said. His voice was rough in a way it almost never was. "You can call me that." Clara nodded once, with the satisfied gravity of someone who has completed an item of business. "All right, Papa," she said, and she looked back at her primer. Caleb looked at Evelyn. She looked at him. She saw the brightness in his eyes that he was not quite managing, and she thought about 6 years of that big house being silent, and the photograph of Margaret on the desk, and what it must have cost him to carry that particular loss and keep his accounts in order and his hands moving and his ranch running and never let anyone see where the cost of it lived inside him. She crossed the kitchen and put her hand on his shoulder, briefly, just a touch. He put his hand over hers, just for a moment. Then they went back to what they were doing, because that was the other thing she had learned, that the greatest moments between two people are often followed immediately by the return of ordinary life, and that is not a diminishment. That is the point. Spring arrived in April, and with it something that Evelyn had not permitted herself to anticipate, the specific pleasure of a garden that she did not have to plan entirely around survival. The Harper Farm lease covered what it covered, and Caleb's ranch produced what it produced, and she was not calculating the minimum any longer. She was planning for abundance. She put in twice the kitchen garden she'd ever managed before, and she ordered seed she'd never been able to afford. And she spent an afternoon in the weak April sun with her hands in the soil and felt, in a way that arrived without warning and stayed, entirely and simply happy. She told Caleb about it that evening. She was trying to explain the specific quality of it, not dramatic happiness, not the happiness of the proposal or the wedding or Clara's word at the kitchen table, but the quiet, ordinary kind that arrives without announcement and simply inhabits a person. He listened in the way he always did. Then he said, "I know the kind you mean." "When did you feel it?" she asked. He thought about it. "The third morning you came to work the south quarter fence," he said. "The morning you didn't argue when I handed you the post hole digger and just took it and went to work. Like we'd been doing it together for years." He paused. Like it was just already true. She looked at him. "That was July," she said. "We were no," he said. "I was considerably ahead of schedule." She laughed. The real laugh. He smiled the full smile. Clara, from somewhere else in the house, called out, "What's funny?" And both of them said, simultaneously, "Nothing," and Clara's disbelieving silence from the other room was itself a kind of laughter. The town of Red Willow arrived at its own reckoning with the Hawthorns by increments, the way communities always do, not in a single public moment of acknowledgement, but in the gradual accumulation of small reversals. Marta Hensley began buying preserves. Not at the market stall, which no longer existed in the same form, but she sent her daughter to the ranch with a note asking whether Mrs. Hawthorne still put up blackberry and whether she could purchase 4 jars. Evelyn sent back 6 with a note that said they were a gift, and she hoped Marta's family enjoyed them. It was imperfect. It was also a beginning, and Evelyn was a woman who understood the value of beginnings. Harold Bishop was harder and did not change entirely, and she made her peace with that, 'cause some people did not change, and the energy spent waiting for them was better directed elsewhere. Patricia Cole came to her in May with a request that Evelyn volunteer for the church auxiliary's relief effort for 3 homesteading families who had had a bad winter. She asked Evelyn specifically because, she said, straightforwardly and without excessive decoration, you understand what it is to need help and to not know how to accept it. Those families need someone who knows both things. Evelyn accepted. She went to the 3 families, and she brought food, and she sat at their tables, and she told them the plain truth that asking for help was not the same as being defeated. That a woman who carried everything alone was brave, and that a woman who learned to carry it with others was braver. That the hardest thing she had ever done was not fixing the fence, or facing Aldrich, or walking into the parsonage and demanding to be heard. The hardest thing she had ever done was believe that she deserved what she was fighting to keep. She watched the women at those kitchen tables receive this information and felt it land in them the way it had landed in her, not as inspiration, which she had always found too light to hold on to, but as something heavier and more durable. As something true. June brought the first anniversary of Caleb, offering her work's south quarter fence, which she did not, but which she was privately aware of, in the way she was aware of all the dates that had turned out to matter. She was in the garden when he came to find her, and she stood up and he handed her a small package wrapped in cloth, and she opened it, and inside was a leather work glove, just the one. Just the left hand, the one she always wore out first. She looked at it, then she looked at him. "I noticed," he said simply. She thought about the months of him paying attention to her, to the fence, to the post hole digger, to the crack in the shovel handle she'd wrapped with leather, to the way she wore out her left glove first, and she thought about what it meant to be seen in the ordinary details, as much as in the large ones. That was the real thing, not the proposals and the legal battles and the moments of drama. The noticing, the specific daily, accumulated noticing that said, "I see who you are." All of it, the ordinary parts too. "Thank you," she said. "1 year," he said. She agreed. She put the glove on. She went back to her garden. He stood there for a moment watching her, and then he went back to the work he'd been doing, and the June morning continued around them both, the ranch alive with its usual sound and movement. Clara at school learning things she would come home and tell them about with the thoroughness of a 9-year-old who considers her parents an appropriate audience for everything, and the life they had built, held itself together with the quiet confidence of something built correctly. There was a morning in August, a full year after Caleb had first pulled his horse up at her fence line and offered her work. When Evelyn stood at the door of the ranch house in the early light and looked at everything she could see from where she stood. The land, the barn, Tomas crossing the yard, Clara's bedroom window. The kitchen behind her where the coffee was already on, because Caleb had made it, he'd been making it for months now, he'd learned how she took it, and he made it without being asked. She thought about the woman who had stood in a broken kitchen in July heat, with the last of her flour on the table, and made a sound from the floor of her chest that had nowhere to go. She thought about 3 years of straight spines and level chins, and shaking alone in private. She thought about the specific weight of being unseen, not invisible. Never invisible, but looked at and dismissed, looked at and found wanting. Looked at and found too large and too poor and too alone to warrant the particular quality of attention says, "You matter." She had mattered. She had always mattered. She had needed someone to hold their gaze long enough for her to remember it, and he had held it, steady and certain, and entirely without flinching, for a year now, and she had looked back, and the looking back had saved her not from Aldrich, not from the bank, not from any of the external things, but from the internal one. From the voice that had been telling her, in the language of 3 years of careful solitude, that she was someone the world was allowed to overlook. She was not someone the world was allowed to overlook. She had proven it. He had helped her prove it. Clara had announced it to every room she entered. And Red Willow, Montana, slowly and imperfectly, and with the particular grace of a community arriving at a truth it should have known sooner, had begun to agree. Caleb came to stand beside her in the doorway. He was carrying his coffee, and he stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the morning air, and he looked at the same thing she was looking at, the land, the morning, the life they had made, and he said nothing for a while. "What are you thinking?" he asked finally. She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about everything now. "I'm thinking that I almost didn't let this happen," she said. "That I almost turned you away every single time. The work offer. The note." She paused. "The proposal." "You didn't, though," he said. "No," she said, "I didn't." He was quiet for a moment. "What changed your mind each time?" She thought about it. "You kept showing up," she said. "Without asking me to be grateful, without making me feel like I owed you something for being seen. You just kept showing up, and eventually I understood that you weren't going to stop, and that the choice between being alone and being obligated." She looked at him. "The choice was between being alone and being with you. And," she said, "you are considerably better than being alone." He made a sound, the low, genuine laugh that she had earned, and kept adding to her collection of things about him that she intended to keep. He looked at her with the full open expression that was hers now, that she had watched open like a room that had been closed for years, and was finally full of light and sound, and the ordinary beautiful noise of a life being lived. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She looked at him. She thought about the woman Red Willow had called too big, too broken, too much, the woman everyone had watched suffer in silence and decided was not their problem. She thought about what it meant to have been that woman, and to have refused in the end to be only that. To have picked up the shovel and repaired the ditch and told the truth in the parsonage and stood in the market square and said clearly to anyone with ears, "My life is mine." She took his free hand. He held it the way he always held it, completely, without reservation, with the full and certain grip of a man who knows what he is holding and has no intention of letting it go. The woman they had whispered about and looked away from and tried to take everything from had not disappeared. She had not diminished. She had not bent herself into the smaller shape the town had decided she should occupy. She had built a life so full and so real and so entirely hers that there was simply no longer any room in it for the smallness of other people's expectations. And she stood in the August morning on the doorstep of Hawthorne Ranch, with her husband's hand in hers, and her daughter's voice, coming from somewhere inside the house, and the whole long, beautiful, difficult real life she had earned stretching out in front of her, and she was not afraid of any of it. Not one single bit of it. She had done the hardest thing a person can do. She had survived what should have broken her, and she had let herself be loved on the other side of it. And she had looked the world directly in the eye and refused to apologize for taking up exactly the space she was owed. That was who Evelyn Hawthorne was. That was who she had always been. And not one person in Red Willow, Montana, not one person in the whole wide American West would ever make her forget it again.